Hey everyone, welcome to Animind. Today I want to argue that Light Yagami is the most realistic villain ever written in anime. Not because of the Death Note, not because of his intelligence, but because of how accurately his story shows what happens when a genuinely good person is handed power they were never supposed to have, and how that power eats away at everything they once were until there is nothing left. Light didn't start as a monster. He started as a perfect student, a caring son, a young man who looked at the world and genuinely wanted it to be better. And then he picked up a notebook, and over the course of 6 years, every good thing about him was replaced by something colder, something darker, something that could sit beside his dying father and think about strategy instead of grief. That transformation from a boy who wanted justice to a man who thought he was God is what makes Death Note one of the greatest psychological stories ever told. And today, we are going to break down every single step of that fall. But before we begin, I'd just like to kindly ask you all to subscribe. It is completely free and it really helps us improve the videos for this wonderful community we have managed to build. Anyway, that is enough. Let us begin. Section 1. The Perfect Student. Light Yagami was, by every measure that mattered to the world around him, the perfect young man. At 17 years old, he was a student at Daikoku Private Academy in the Kanto region of Japan. And he wasn't just a good student, he was the best. Light consistently scored at the top of national exams, ranking #1 across the entire country. His grades were flawless. His test scores were flawless. In the eyes of his teachers, his classmates, and his family, Light Yagami had no weaknesses. He was the kind of student that parents pointed to when they wanted their own children to try harder. The kind of student that teachers brought up in staff meetings as proof that their school was doing something right. And all of that pressure, all of that praise, all of those expectations, they didn't seem to bother him at all. Light carried it like it was nothing. Like being the best in the country was just the natural state of things. But Light wasn't just a bookworm locked away in his room. He was well-rounded in a way that almost felt unfair to the people around him. He was athletic, he was socially aware, and he was considered very handsome. Multiple characters throughout the series note his appearance, including Misa Amane and Kiyomi Takada, both of whom are drawn to him partly because of his looks. Light knew how to talk to people. He knew how to carry himself. He could walk into a room and read it within seconds, understanding who was important, who was watching, and what they expected from him. For a 17-year-old, that level of social awareness is rare. Most teenagers are still figuring out how to hold a conversation without making it awkward. Light had already mastered the art of making people see exactly what he wanted them to see. His family life, at least on the surface, seemed stable. His father, Soichiro Yagami, was the chief of the National Police Agency in Japan, which meant the Yagami household was built around a strong sense of duty and law. Soichiro was a man who believed deeply in justice, in doing things the right way, in following the rules no matter how difficult that got. Light grew up watching his father dedicate long hours to police work, sometimes at the cost of being present at home. His mother, Sachiko, kept the household running, and his younger sister, Sayu, looked up to Light the way any younger sibling would look up to a brother who seemed to have everything figured out. By all appearances, this was a normal, well-functioning Japanese family. There was no obvious trauma, no clear dysfunction, nothing that would make you look at the Yagami household and think something terrible was about to come out of it. And that's part of what makes Light's story so unsettling. He didn't come from a broken home. He wasn't abused. He wasn't neglected in any obvious way. If anything, he had more going for him than most people could ever dream of. Intelligence, looks, a stable family, a respected father, academic achievement that put him at the very top of his entire country. By every standard that society uses to measure success, Light Yagami had already won before his life had even really started. The creator of Death Note, Tsugumi Oba, has said that if Ryuk had never dropped the Death Note into the human world, Light would have likely become one of the greatest police leaders the world had ever seen. He would have followed in his father's footsteps, probably surpassed him, and spent his life fighting crime from within the system. That was the path that was laid out for him. That was the future everyone expected. But here's where things start to crack. Because even before the Death Note entered his life, Light Yagami was not as content as he appeared to be. The very first time we see him in the series, he's sitting in his classroom at Daikoku Private Academy, and he's bored. Not the kind of bored where you're just waiting for the bell to ring so you can go eat lunch. This was a deeper kind of boredom. The kind that settles into your bones and makes you feel like nothing around you is worth paying attention to. Light is staring out the window while his teacher lectures, and the look on his face tells you everything. This is a young man who has already decided that the world around him has nothing left to offer him. School is too easy. The lessons are too simple. The people around him are too ordinary. Light had reached the top so early in life that by 17, he had already run out of things to climb toward. That boredom is important. It wasn't just a teenager being dramatic about having to sit through another math class. It was a sign of something much deeper going on inside Light's head. When a person reaches the top of everything they attempt, and they do it without much struggle, something strange can happen to the way they see themselves and the world around them. They start to feel separate from other people. They start to feel like they exist on a different level. And because nobody around them is challenging them or pushing back against them, that feeling just keeps growing and growing with nothing to stop it. Light didn't have an intellectual equal in his daily life. His classmates couldn't match him, his teachers couldn't challenge him, even his father, as respected as Soichiro was, didn't operate on the same intellectual level as his son. Light was surrounded by people, but in his own mind, he was completely alone at the top. And it wasn't just boredom with school. Light looked at the world itself and saw something rotten. The series makes this very clear from the beginning. Light watched the news. He saw the crime reports. He saw murderers getting away with their actions. And he felt a deep frustration with how broken the system was. Remember, his father was the chief of the National Police Agency. Light had a front row seat to how the justice system worked, and more importantly, how it failed. He saw criminals walk free. He saw cases go unsolved. He saw good people suffer, while bad people faced no real punishment. And for someone who already believed he was smarter than everyone around him, that knowledge was poison. Because it didn't just make him angry at the criminals. It made him angry at the system itself. It made him angry at the people who were supposed to fix things but couldn't. And somewhere deep down, it probably made him believe that if he were the one in charge, things would be different. Oba has also stated something fascinating about Light before the Death Note. He described pre-Death Note Light as a young man who could understand the pain of others. That's a crucial detail. It tells us that Light was not born without the ability to care about people. He wasn't wired from birth to be cold and calculating. There was genuine empathy in him at some point. He could look at someone who was suffering and feel something real. He could watch the news and be genuinely bothered by the injustice he saw, not because it offended his ego, but because he understood that real people were being hurt. That version of Light, the one who could feel other people's pain, is the version that would have become the great police leader Oba described. That was the version of Light that his family knew and loved. That was the version that Sayu looked up to, and that Sachiko was proud of, and that Soichiro was grooming to follow in his footsteps. But empathy and ambition are a dangerous combination when they exist alongside a mind that believes it is better than everyone else's. Light didn't just want the world to be better. He believed, even before the Death Note, that he was one of the few people smart enough to actually make it better. That distinction matters enormously. Wanting to help people is one thing. Believing that you are uniquely qualified to help people, that without you things would fall apart, that nobody else could possibly do what you can do, that's something else entirely. And Light carried that belief with him long before a black notebook fell out of the sky. It showed in the way he carried himself, in the way he looked at his classmates with barely hidden disinterest, in the way he sat in that classroom staring out the window like the entire building was beneath him. The constant praise didn't help either. When you're told from a young age that you're exceptional, and when every test score and every achievement confirms that message, it becomes very easy to stop seeing yourself as a regular person who happens to be talented, and start seeing yourself as someone who is fundamentally different from everyone else. Light received praise from his teachers, admiration from his peers, respect from adults, and attention from girls, and none of it seemed to satisfy him. That's the thing about Light before the Death Note. He had everything a 17-year-old could want, and he was still empty. He was still bored. He was still looking out that window, waiting for something, anything, that would match the size of the person he believed himself to be. Light also showed something else before the Death Note that most people overlook. He was already interested in justice and law enforcement. He had helped his father with cases in the past, and even volunteered with the police department. On the surface, that looks like the behavior of a good kid, following in his dad's footsteps. and maybe part of it was. But there's another way to read it. Light wasn't just interested in justice. He was interested in being the one who delivered it. He wasn't content to just study law or learn about the system. He wanted to be in the room where decisions were made, where outcomes were decided, where power was actually held. Even his career ambitions pointed toward control. Not service, not sacrifice, but control over how justice was carried out. So when we talk about who Light Yagami was before the Death Note, we need to hold two things in our heads at the same time. On one hand, he was genuinely brilliant, genuinely capable, and according to his creator, genuinely able to feel empathy for others. He had all the tools to become someone truly great. On the other hand, he was already bored with a world that couldn't challenge him, already frustrated with systems that couldn't meet his standards, already carrying a quiet belief that he was different from and above the people around him, and already drawn to positions of control rather than positions of service. The seeds were already planted. The soil was already fertile. All that was missing was the thing that would make it all grow. And that thing came on an ordinary afternoon, falling from the sky and landing in the schoolyard where Light Yagami happened to be looking out the window at exactly the right moment. A plain black notebook with 2 words written on the cover, Death Note. And the moment he picked it up, the perfect student began walking a path that would turn him into something his family, his teachers, and even he himself would never have predicted. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But picking up the notebook is one thing. Actually using it to kill a real human being is something else entirely. And what happened in the hours after Light brought that notebook home reveals more about his psychology than almost anything else in the entire series. Section 2. The First Kill. It was November 28th, 2003, and Light Yagami was sitting in his bedroom with a black notebook in his hand. He had picked it up from the schoolyard at Daikoku Private Academy earlier that day, after watching it fall from the sky while he sat bored in class staring out the window. The notebook had 2 words written on its cover, Death Note, and on the inside there were rules. The very first rule said that the human whose name is written in this notebook shall die. It also said that the person writing must have the face of the victim in mind while writing the name, so that people sharing the same name wouldn't be affected. And if no cause of death is specified within 40 seconds of writing the name, the person will simply die of a heart attack. Light read all of this, and his first reaction was not excitement. It was not curiosity. It was doubt. He looked at this notebook, with its very specific rules and its very bold claims, and thought it was a joke. He actually said it out loud. He called it pretty detailed for a prank. And honestly, that reaction makes sense. If any one of us found a notebook on the ground that claimed it could kill people just by writing their names in it, we'd probably think the same thing. We'd laugh it off. We'd assume some bored kid with a dark sense of humor had put it together and dropped it somewhere for someone to find. That's the reasonable, normal response. And for a brief moment, Light had that reasonable, normal response. He put the notebook down. He dismissed it. He moved on with his evening. But he didn't stay away from it. That's the first crack. Light picked the notebook back up. Something about it pulled him back in. And whether that something was curiosity, boredom, or the faintest whisper of a thought that maybe, just maybe, it could be real, he opened it again. And then he decided to test it. Not because he believed it would work. At least, that's what he told himself. He decided to test it because he wanted to prove to himself that it was fake. That's how he framed it in his own mind. Just a test. Just an experiment. Nothing more. He turned on the television and watched the news. And what came up on the screen was a live report about a hostage situation. A 42-year-old unemployed man named Kuro Otoharada had attacked a nursery school and was holding 8 people hostage inside, including children and staff members. His name and face were being broadcast on national television as the situation unfolded in real time. Otoharada was a violent man. He had killed and injured 6 people previously in an attack at a shopping center. And now here he was again, threatening the lives of innocent children. The news showed his face. The news showed his name. And Light Yagami, sitting in his bedroom with the Death Note open in front of him, had everything he needed. He wrote the name, Kuro Otoharada. He pictured the man's face as it appeared on the television screen, and then he waited. 40 seconds. That's what the rule said. 40 seconds for the death to take effect if no specific cause was written. So Light sat there, watching the clock, watching the television, and waiting. And as those 40 seconds passed and nothing happened right away, Light started to relax. He started to believe what he had already told himself. It was fake. It was a prank. The notebook was nothing. He felt a sense of relief wash over him, because if the notebook didn't work, then he hadn't done anything wrong. He was just a kid who wrote a name in a strange notebook he found on the ground. No harm done. And then the news anchor's tone changed. The broadcast cut back to the scene outside the nursery school, and the hostages were coming out. All of them. Safe. Walking out of the building on their own. And then came the report that Kuruo Otoharada had collapsed inside. He was dead. Heart attack. Exactly the way the notebook said it would happen. Exactly 40 seconds after Light wrote his name. Now here is where the psychology of Light Yagami starts to reveal itself, because his reaction to this moment is one of the most important scenes in the entire series. Light did not celebrate. He did not smile. He did not feel powerful. He felt terror. Genuine, shaking, overwhelming terror. The realization hit him like a wall. The notebook was real. He had just killed a human being, not in some abstract, theoretical way. He had written a name, and a man had died. A real person with a real body had collapsed and stopped breathing because of what Light did in his bedroom with a pen. The weight of that truth was crushing, and for a moment, Light Yagami looked exactly like what he was. A 17-year-old kid who had just done something he could never take back. But Light's mind didn't stay in that place of horror for long. Almost immediately, a second thought crept in alongside the fear. Otoharada was a bad person. He was a killer. He was holding children hostage. Those children were now safe because Otoharada was dead. And Otoharada was dead because of what Light did. That calculation started running in the background of his mind even as his hands were still shaking. Yes, he had killed someone. But the person he killed was a monster. And the people that monster was threatening were innocent. So was what Light did really wrong? Or did he actually just save lives? That thought alone should have been enough to scare him. The speed with which his brain moved from horror to justification, from guilt to reasoning, from I just killed a man to, but he deserved it. That speed was remarkable. Most people, if they somehow found themselves in Light's position, would have thrown the notebook away. They would have burned it. They would have buried it in the backyard and never spoken of it again. The guilt and the fear would have been enough to keep them away from it forever. But Light didn't throw it away. He kept it. And worse than that, he went looking for a second test. The same night, Light left his house. He walked the streets. And it's important to understand what he was doing here. He wasn't wandering aimlessly. He was looking for someone. He was looking for another person to test the notebook on. Because one death could be a coincidence. Otoharada had been in a high-stress hostage situation. Heart attacks happen. Maybe it was just timing. Maybe Light got lucky, or unlucky, depending on how you look at it. He needed a second test to know for sure. That's how he justified it to himself. He needed to be certain. And then he found his target. A man named Takuo Shibuimaru, who called himself Shibutaku, was out with a group of bikers and was harassing a woman on the street. In the anime, the scene shows Shibuimaru and his group attempting to sexually assault this woman, restraining her while she struggled to get away. Light witnessed this happening in front of him. He heard Shibuimaru announce his own name out loud, which gave Light everything the Death Note required. A name and a face. Light didn't hesitate for nearly as long this time. He hid the Death Note behind a magazine and began writing. But because the Death Note requires the name to be spelled correctly, and because Japanese names can be written using different characters that produce the same sound, Light wrote multiple possible versions of Takuo Shibuimaru's name to make sure at least one of them was right. He also did something he hadn't done with Otoharada. He specified a cause of death. Instead of leaving it blank and letting the default heart attack take effect, Light wrote that Shibuimaru should die by traffic accident. This was a deliberate choice. He wanted to see if the notebook could do more than just cause heart attacks. He wanted to see if he could control not just whether someone died, but how they died. 40 seconds later, the woman broke free and ran. Shibuimaru chased after her on his motorcycle, and a truck slammed into him, killing him instantly, exactly the way Light had written it. Traffic accident. No ambiguity. No coincidence. The death note was real, and Light now knew it with absolute certainty. His reaction after the second kill was different from the first. There was still shock. There was still fear. But there was something new mixed in with it this time. In the manga, it's noted that Light felt guilt over killing Shibuimaru specifically because, unlike Otoharada, Shibuimaru was not a convicted criminal. He was a street thug, a bully, someone who was doing something terrible in that moment on that street. But he wasn't a murderer or a hostage taker. He was, by any reasonable standard, someone who belonged in a jail cell, not in a grave. And some small part of Light recognized that. Some small part of him understood that he had just killed a man whose crime, while awful, did not deserve a death sentence. That flicker of guilt is proof that the old Light, the one Oba described as someone who could understand the pain of others, was still in there somewhere. He hadn't disappeared completely. Not yet. But here's the thing about that guilt. It didn't last. It didn't grow. It didn't make Light stop. What happened instead is something that would define the rest of his life. Light took the horror of what he had done, and the guilt that came with it, and he buried them both under a mountain of logic. He started talking himself through it. These were bad people. The world is rotten. Someone has to do something. The justice system is broken. Criminals walk free every day. Innocent people suffer because nobody is willing to do what needs to be done. And now, for the first time in human history, someone has the power to actually fix that. Someone has a tool that can remove the worst people from the planet, cleanly, quietly, and without any risk to the innocent. And that someone just happens to be the smartest student in Japan. That someone just happens to have the intelligence, the discipline, and the nerve to use this power correctly. That someone is Light Yagami. The transformation that happened over the next 5 days was staggering. By the time Ryuk, the Shinigami who had originally dropped the Death Note into the human world, showed up to see who had picked it up, Light had already filled pages of the notebook with names. Not 2 names, not 10 names, pages. Hundreds of criminals, all researched, all identified by name and face, all written into the Death Note and killed. Ryuk, a literal god of death, was surprised. He had dropped the notebook because he was bored in the Shinigami realm and wanted to see what a human would do with it. He expected curiosity. He expected maybe a kill or two. He did not expect to find a teenager who had already started what could only be described as a mass execution of the world's criminal population. And that's what makes the first episode of Death Note so brilliant. It doesn't show you a villain being born. It shows you a normal person, a smart, bored, frustrated 17-year-old with a strong sense of right and wrong, making a series of small decisions that each feel almost reasonable in the moment. Testing the notebook the first time feels like curiosity. Testing it the second time feels like confirmation. And once you know the power is real, the question of whether or not to use it starts to feel less like a moral choice and more like a practical one. Light didn't wake up one morning and decide to become a mass killer. He slid into it one rationalization at a time, and each step felt just small enough that he could convince himself he was still the good guy. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The guilt after Otoharada lasted minutes. The guilt after Shibuimaru lasted even less. And by the time Ryuk arrived 5 days later, the guilt was gone entirely, replaced by something far more dangerous. Light wasn't scared anymore. He wasn't uncertain. He wasn't conflicted. He was convinced. Convinced that the Death Note had come to him for a reason. Convinced that he was the only person capable of using it the right way. Convinced that what he was doing wasn't murder at all, but justice. And that conviction, that unshakable belief that he and he alone was chosen to cleanse the world, would soon grow into something with a name of its own. Something that would consume the boy who used to be the perfect student and replace him with something the world had never seen before. Section 3. The Birth of Kira. 5 days. That's all it took. 5 days between Light Yagami picking up the Death Note and Ryuk, the Shinigami who dropped it, showing up in his bedroom to see what had happened. Ryuk had been bored in the Shinigami realm, a gray and lifeless world where gods of death spent their days gambling and doing nothing. He had tricked the old Shinigami king into giving him a second death note, and then he dropped it into the human world just to see what would happen. It was entertainment to him, a game. He wanted to watch a human discover the notebook and find out what they would do with it. What he didn't expect was to walk into Light Yagami's bedroom and find pages upon pages already filled with names. Ryuk appeared in Light's room without warning. A towering, inhuman figure with bulging yellow eyes, a permanent grin stretched across his gray face, and wings folded behind his back. Any normal person would have screamed. Any normal person would have been paralyzed with fear at the sight of a literal death god standing in their bedroom. But Light Yagami didn't scream. He didn't run. He didn't even flinch. He looked at Ryuk and told him that he had been waiting for him. He said he had already figured out that the notebook was real, and that he was prepared. He even asked Ryuk if he was there to take his soul, showing that Light had already accepted the possibility that using the Death Note might come with a price, and he had decided to pay it anyway. 5 days in, and this 17-year-old was already talking to a god of death like it was a business meeting. And then came the conversation that changed everything. Light explained to Ryuk exactly what he had been doing and exactly what he planned to do going forward. He told Ryuk that the world was rotten, that criminals were everywhere, that the justice system was broken, and that somebody needed to do something about it. And since the Death Note had fallen into his hands, since he was the one who found it, since he had the intelligence and the discipline to use it correctly, he would be that somebody. He would use the Death Note to kill every criminal he could find. He would cleanse the world of evil. And when the criminals were gone, and the good people of the world could finally live in peace, he would rule over that new world. Not as a president, not as a king, as a god. Light Yagami, sitting in his bedroom surrounded by pages of dead men's names, looked a Shinigami in the eye and declared that he was going to become the god of the new world. Ryuk's response to this was telling. He didn't laugh. He didn't mock Light. He simply said that if Light killed all the bad people in the world, then Light himself would be the only bad person left. It was a simple observation, almost casual, but it cut right to the heart of what Light was doing. Light didn't understand the remark, or maybe he chose not to understand it. He brushed it off by pointing out that he was one of the best students in Japan, as if academic achievement somehow made what he was doing acceptable, as if being smart and being right were the same thing. But there's another moment from this conversation that matters even more, and it's a moment that a lot of people miss. When Light was explaining his plans, there was a clear sense in his words that he believed the Death Note had come to him for a reason, that he was meant to find it, that out of all the people in the world, he was the one chosen to receive this power. Ryuk shut that idea down immediately. He told Light plainly that the notebook fell by chance. He didn't drop it for Light specifically. He didn't choose Light. He dropped it because he was bored and wanted to see what would happen. It could have been picked up by anyone, a teacher, a criminal, a child, anyone who happened to walk by. There was nothing special about Light finding it. It was random. This is one of the most important details in the entire series, because Light either didn't hear it or didn't care. Even after Ryuk told him point blank that the Death Note fell by accident, Light continued to behave as though he had been chosen. He continued to talk about himself as someone with a mission, someone who was selected by fate to carry out a grand purpose. The evidence said otherwise. The god of death who actually dropped the notebook said otherwise. But Light's mind had already rewritten the story. In his version of events, the Death Note didn't fall randomly into a schoolyard. It was delivered to him, to the smartest student in Japan, to the one person who would know exactly what to do with it. Light needed to believe that, because the alternative, that all of this was just blind luck, that there was nothing special about him finding the notebook, was something his ego simply could not accept. Meanwhile, the world outside Light's bedroom was starting to notice. Criminals were dying, not just a few, and not in random ways. They were dying of heart attacks. Dozens of them, then hundreds, all over Japan and eventually around the world. Murderers, kidnappers, violent offenders, all dropping dead from sudden cardiac arrest with no explanation. The public noticed, the media noticed, and the people of Japan started talking. They started speculating about who or what could be causing this. and they gave this mysterious force a name: Kira. It came from the Japanese way of pronouncing the English word killer, Kira. It spread through the news, through the internet, through conversations in homes and offices and schools. And just like that, Light Yagami had an identity that was separate from his own. He was Light at school, Light at the dinner table, Light when he helped his sister with her homework. But in the shadows, to the world, he was Kira. Light didn't just accept this name, he shaped what it meant. He was very deliberate about how he killed and when he killed. He made sure criminals died of heart attacks specifically because he wanted the pattern to be noticed. He wanted the world to see that someone was doing this on purpose. He wanted criminals to know that if they committed a crime, they would die. And he wanted ordinary law-abiding people to feel safe, knowing that someone was out there punishing the wicked. Light was building a brand. Kira wasn't just a killer. Kira was a message. Kira was a warning. And for millions of people around the world, Kira was becoming something even bigger than that. Kira was becoming a savior. But if the public's reaction fed Light's growing belief in himself, it was the Lind L. Taylor incident that truly revealed what Kira had become. The International Criminal Police Organization, known as Interpol, had taken notice of the mass deaths and held a meeting to address the crisis. The result of that meeting was the involvement of L, considered the world's greatest detective, a man whose real name and face were completely unknown to the public. L had solved cases that nobody else could touch, and now he was turning his attention to Kira. L's first move was brilliant. He arranged a television broadcast that was announced as a worldwide address from Interpol. A man appeared on screen, sitting behind a podium, and introduced himself as L. He declared that the Kira case was the most terrible act of mass murder in history, and that he would not rest until Kira was brought to justice. And then he said something that hit Light Yagami like a punch to the chest. He called Kira evil. Not misguided, not dangerous, evil. That single word was all it took. Light was watching the broadcast from his bedroom, and when this man who claimed to be L looked into the camera and said what Kira was doing was evil, something inside Light snapped. He didn't pause to think. He didn't consider whether this might be a trap. He didn't stop to evaluate whether killing a man on live television in response to being called a name was the rational, godlike behavior he claimed to embody. He grabbed the death note and wrote the name that was displayed on screen: Lind L. Taylor. 40 seconds later, the man on television clutched his chest and collapsed. Dead. Heart attack. Right there on the broadcast for the entire viewing audience to see. Light leaned back in his chair with the satisfaction of someone who had just won an argument. He had proven his power. He had killed a man who dared to challenge him, and he had done it in front of the whole world. For a few seconds, Light Yagami believed he had just eliminated the greatest threat to his plans with a single stroke of his pen. And then L spoke again. The man who had died was not L. He was a convicted criminal named Lind L. Taylor, who had been sentenced to death and was used as a decoy. His name had never been released to the public, meaning Kira could not have known who he was through normal channels. The real L was still alive, still hidden, and now he knew several things he hadn't known before. He knew that Kira could kill without being anywhere near his victims. He knew that Kira needed a name and a face to kill. And most importantly, he knew where Kira was, because the broadcast that was announced as a worldwide address had actually only been shown in the Kanto region of Japan. L had planned to broadcast it in other regions one at a time until he got a response, but Kira had reacted to the very first broadcast. L even pointed out that Light's first kill, Kuro Otoharada, had been a criminal whose hostage situation was only reported on Kanto's local television. Kira was in Kanto. L had found him before the game had even properly begun. Light was furious. He screamed at the television. He raged at the screen. But what he was really angry about wasn't just that he had been tricked. It was that he had been made to look stupid. The smartest student in Japan, the self-proclaimed future god of the new world, had fallen for the oldest trick in detective work. A decoy. A fake. And he had fallen for it because of his own pride. When Lind L. Taylor called Kira evil, Light didn't respond with the cold, calculating logic he loved to pride himself on. He responded with emotion, with fury, with the wounded ego of a teenage boy who could not stand being told he was wrong. And that reaction, that split-second decision to kill a man on live television simply because that man insulted him, tells us everything we need to know about who Kira really was at his core. Light had told himself and told Ryuk that he was killing criminals to make the world a better place. That was his mission. That was his purpose. But Lind L. Taylor wasn't a criminal, as far as Light knew in that moment. He was, in Light's mind, a detective who had challenged him publicly, and Light killed him anyway. Not because it served his mission, not because it made the world safer, but because someone had the nerve to stand up and say that what Kira was doing was wrong. And Light could not tolerate that. The mask slipped in that moment, even if Light himself didn't realize it. The boy who said he wanted to rid the world of criminals had just killed a man for the crime of disagreeing with him. The boy who said he was building a better world had just revealed that his definition of a better world was one where nobody was allowed to tell him no. The boy who said he was justice had just shown that his version of justice looked an awful lot like revenge against anyone who bruised his pride. And yet, instead of forcing Light to question himself, the Lind L. Taylor incident only pushed him further. He didn't look at what had happened and think maybe he had gone too far. Instead, he looked at L's challenge and accepted it. He told Ryuk and himself that he would find L. He would discover his real name, and he would kill him. Not because L was a criminal, not because L was making the world worse, but because L was the one person in the world who was smart enough to stop him, and Light Yagami could not allow that. Kira was born the moment Light wrote Kuro Otoharada's name in the Death Note. But Kira became real, became a fully formed identity with a purpose and a mission and an ego that could swallow the world. In that conversation with Ryuk and in that confrontation with L. The boy who found a notebook was gone. In his place stood something new, something that believed it was above human law, above human judgment, above humanity itself. Something that would grow more dangerous and more certain of its own righteousness with every passing day, until the word Kira stopped meaning killer in Light's mind and started meaning something much closer to God. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But declaring yourself a god is one thing. Actually believing it, deep in your bones, to the point where you lose the ability to see yourself as anything else, that's something far darker. And that transformation was already well underway. Section 4. The God Complex. There's a moment early in Death Note that tells you exactly where Light Yagami's mind is heading, and it happens before the bodies have even started piling up in large numbers. When Ryuk first appeared in his bedroom and explained the nature of the Death Note and the Shinigami, Light didn't cower. He didn't beg for mercy. He didn't ask Ryuk to take the notebook back. Instead, he sat in his chair, looked a god of death in the face, and told him that he was going to use the Death Note to create a new world. And then, without any hesitation, without any doubt in his voice, he said the words that would define everything that came after. He declared that he would become the god of the new world. Not the leader, not the protector, not the guardian, the god. A 17-year-old high school student who had been using the Death Note for 5 days looked at an actual supernatural being, a creature that existed to end human lives, and told him that he, Light Yagami, was going to ascend to a position above all of humanity. And the most unsettling part isn't that he said it, it's that he meant it. There was no sarcasm in his voice, there was no exaggeration. Light wasn't using the word God loosely, the way someone might say they're the king of something they're good at. He meant it in the most literal sense he could imagine. He was going to sit at the top of the world, and everyone below him would live or die based on his judgment. To understand how Light got to that point so quickly, you have to understand what the Death Note actually did to his sense of himself. Before the notebook, Light was already someone who believed he was smarter than everyone around him. He was already bored with a world that couldn't challenge him. He already carried a quiet sense of superiority that showed itself in the way he looked at his classmates, in the way he dismissed his teachers, in the way he felt frustrated by a justice system that couldn't match his own standards. But all of that superiority was contained. It had nowhere to go. Light could feel smarter than everyone, but he couldn't do anything about it. He was still just a student, still just a teenager living in his parents' house, helping his sister with her homework, eating dinner at the family table, going to school every morning like every other kid in Japan. His belief that he was special had no outlet. The Death Note gave it one. Suddenly, Light wasn't just smarter than everyone else. He had power that no one else had. He could end a human life by writing a name on a page. He could decide who lived and who died without leaving his bedroom. He could reach across the entire world, touch someone he had never met, and stop their heart. That kind of power doesn't just change what a person can do, it changes how they see themselves. And for someone who already believed he was above the people around him, the Death Note didn't create a new belief. It confirmed the one that was already there. It took that quiet voice in the back of Light's mind, the one that whispered, "You are different, you are better, you are meant for something greater," and it turned the volume all the way up. One of the clearest signs of this shift happened when Ryuk offered Light the Shinigami Eyes deal. This was during the early phase of Light's activities as Kira, when an FBI agent named Ray Penber had been assigned to follow Light as part of the investigation into the mysterious killings. Light knew he was being watched, but he didn't know the name of the person watching him, which meant he couldn't use the Death Note to eliminate this threat. Ryuk told Light that Shinigami have special eyes that allow them to see any human's real name and remaining lifespan just by looking at their face. Ryuk offered to give Light this same ability, but the price was steep, half of Light's remaining lifespan. Whatever years Light had left to live, he would lose half of them. Light refused. And the reason he gave for refusing is one of the most revealing things he ever said. He didn't refuse because he was scared of dying young. He didn't refuse because he thought the price was unfair. He refused because he said he needed to live a long time in order to rule over his new world. Think about what that means. Light wasn't just planning to kill criminals and then go back to living a normal life. He wasn't thinking of this as a temporary mission. He was planning a reign. He was planning to sit at the top of his new world order for decades, watching over humanity like a king on a throne, and he wasn't willing to cut that reign short by a single day. The Shinigami Eyes would have made his life immensely easier. He could have looked at anyone, learned their name instantly, and killed them without needing to research or investigate or manipulate. It would have solved his immediate problem with the FBI agent and every future problem that required knowing someone's name. But Light turned it down, because his vision of himself as a god who would rule for a lifetime was more important than any short-term advantage. Ryuk even noted something interesting during this exchange. He pointed out that Light looked him straight in the eye while refusing the deal, without any of the fear that a normal human would show when face-to-face with a Shinigami. Ryuk was a monster by any human standard, towering, inhuman, with that permanent grin and those unblinking yellow eyes. And Light spoke to him like he was speaking to an employee. Like Ryuk was someone who worked for him, not a supernatural being who could end his life at any moment. That lack of fear wasn't bravery. It was something else entirely. It was Light's growing belief that he was operating on the same level as the gods of death, if not above them. Ryuk even told Light at one point that, even without wings or Shinigami eyes, he already made a fine Shinigami. Light didn't take it as a compliment. He saw himself as far beyond anything Ryuk and his lazy kind represented. As the weeks and months passed, Light's view of himself didn't just stay at the level it was when he first declared himself a future god. It grew. It kept growing. Every criminal he killed reinforced his belief that he was doing the right thing. Every news report about falling crime rates told him his plan was working. Every time someone mentioned Kira with fear or admiration, it fed the part of him that needed the world to recognize what he was. And when the public didn't just notice Kira but started worshiping him, when actual groups of people around the world began treating Kira as a divine figure, as a real god who was cleansing the earth of evil, Light didn't see that worship as a sign that something had gone terribly wrong. He saw it as proof that he was right. This is what happens when someone with Light's level of intelligence and Light's level of self-belief gets handed unlimited power with zero accountability. There was nobody in his life who could check him. His family didn't know what he was doing. His classmates had no idea. Ryuk had no interest in stopping him, because the whole point of dropping the Death Note was entertainment. And L, the one person who was actively trying to stop him, was an enemy to be defeated, not a voice of reason to be heard. Light existed in a bubble where every piece of feedback he received told him the same thing. You are special. You are powerful. You are needed. And nobody, not a single person in his daily life, was saying the opposite. Light's own words across the series paint a picture of someone whose belief in himself went from confident to delusional to something beyond delusional. Early on, he said that the world was rotten and that someone had to fix it. That's a strong opinion, but it's one that many people share. Then he said that he was the only one who could do it. That's a bigger leap, but you can at least follow the logic of someone who has a power nobody else has. But then came the declarations that went far beyond anything rational. He proclaimed himself justice itself, not someone who fought for justice, not someone who believed in justice. He said he was justice. He said he protected the innocent and those who feared evil. He said he was the one who had become the God of a new world that everyone desired. And he said that anyone who opposed him, anyone who stood against what he was doing, was evil. Not mistaken, not misguided, evil. In Light's mind, disagreeing with Kira was the same as being a criminal. Standing in his way was a crime, punishable by death. And he proved that belief with action when he killed Lynd L. Taylor on live television, simply for calling him evil. The language Light used when talking about his mission changed over time in ways that are easy to miss if you're not paying attention. In the beginning, he talked about cleaning up the world, about making it safer, about punishing criminals who the justice system couldn't touch. Those are goals that focus on other people. They're about the world and its problems. But as the series progresses, Light's language shifts. He stops talking about the world and starts talking about himself. He talks about his reign, his new world, his rules, his judgment. The criminals become less important. The safety of innocent people becomes less important. What becomes important is Light's position at the top and his right to stay there. The mission stops being about justice and starts being about power, control, and the absolute certainty that he deserves both. There's a particularly telling moment in the series when Elle states on television that he is justice. Light's immediate response is to shout back that he is justice. Not that what he's doing is just. Not that his cause is righteous. He literally claims the word justice as his personal identity. He is justice. He is the God of the new world, saving it from evil and ridding it of fear. And anyone who betrays God, meaning anyone who betrays him, is evil. That's not the thinking of someone who wants to help people. That's the thinking of someone who has lost the ability to separate himself from his cause, who has merged his identity so completely with his mission that any attack on Kira feels like an attack on the concept of goodness itself. And it's worth noting what Light didn't do during all of this. He didn't question himself. Not once after those first few hours with the Death Note did Light seriously sit down and ask whether what he was doing was wrong. He never paused to consider that maybe killing thousands of people, even guilty people, might not be the best path forward. He never wondered if there were other ways to fight crime that didn't involve becoming a mass killer. He never looked at the body count climbing into the hundreds and then the thousands and felt the weight of what those numbers actually meant. Because in Light's mind, those weren't people he was killing. They were obstacles being removed. They were infections being cured. They were parts of the rotten world that he was cutting away to make room for his perfect one. The Death Note rules even seemed to feed into his God complex in subtle ways. The notebook gave Light control not just over whether someone died, but how they died and when they died. He could specify the cause of death. He could script the victim's final actions in detail, up to 23 days before the death occurred. He could make a prisoner write a message, walk to a specific place, say specific words, and then collapse from a heart attack at exactly the moment Light wanted. That level of control over human life is something that in any religious or mythological tradition belongs to gods. Not to humans, not to teenagers, to gods. And every time Light exercised that control, every time he wrote down a cause of death and watched it play out exactly as he had scripted it, the line between Light Yagami the human and Kira the god got a little thinner. By the time Light was working alongside Elle on the Kira investigation, secretly using their partnership to gather information and protect himself, his god complex was fully formed. He wasn't pretending to be a god anymore. He wasn't working toward becoming one. In his own mind, he already was one. Every decision he made, every life he ended, Every relationship he maintained or discarded was filtered through the question of whether it served his position as the god of the new world. People weren't people to him anymore. They were tools, threats, or irrelevant. His father Soichiro was useful as a source of information about the investigation. The task force members were useful as cover. Ryuk was useful as a source of information about the Death Note's rules. And everyone else. Everyone who didn't serve a function in Light's grand design simply didn't matter. What makes Light's God complex so chilling is that it didn't come from nowhere. It grew step by step, piece by piece, from tendencies that were already inside him long before the Death Note appeared. The boredom, the superiority, the frustration with a world that couldn't match his standards, the quiet belief that he was meant for something greater. The notebook didn't create those feelings. It gave them power. It gave them permission. And once a person like Light Yagami starts believing he is a god, there is no bottom to how far he will fall in pursuit of keeping that belief alive. Because a god cannot be wrong. A god cannot be questioned. A god cannot be held accountable by the creatures he rules over. And that belief, that unshakable conviction that he was above judgment, would shape every relationship in his life, turning the people closest to him into nothing more than pieces on his board. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But the person who would suffer the most from Light's God complex wasn't L, and it wasn't the criminals whose names filled the pages of the Death Note. It was the people who made the mistake of caring about him. The people who trusted him, loved him, and believed in him, only to discover that in the eyes of a self-made god, love and loyalty are just more tools to be used and thrown away. Section 5. The Master Manipulator. If Light Yagami's god complex was the engine that drove him forward, then manipulation was the steering. The Death Note gave him the power to kill, but it was his ability to read people, to understand what they wanted and what they feared, and to use that understanding against them that made him truly dangerous. Light didn't just write names in a notebook. He studied people. He figured out what made them tick, and then he played them like instruments, pulling exactly the right strings at exactly the right moments, all while smiling to their faces and pretending to be their friend, their ally, their son, or their lover. Every single person who got close to Light Yagami became a piece on his chessboard, and not one of them realized it until it was far too late. The first real demonstration of Light's skill as a manipulator came early in the series, with FBI agent Ray Penber. After L narrowed Kira's location down to the Kanto region and began suspecting that Kira might have connections to the police, the FBI sent 12 agents to Japan to investigate the families of officers working the case. Ray Penber was assigned to follow and observe Light Yagami. This was a problem for Light. He knew someone was watching him, but he didn't know who. And without a name and a face, the Death Note was useless. So Light came up with a plan that was so cold, so calculated, that it revealed just how far his mind had already gone. Light staged a bus hijacking. He used the Death Note to manipulate a criminal named Kichiro Osoreda into hijacking a bus that Light was riding with a date. The entire event was carefully scripted. Light had written specific details in the Death Note controlling Osoreda's actions, making him board the bus and threaten the passengers. During the chaos, Light slipped Ray Penber a note claiming he had seen the hijacker's gun and needed help. In the process, Ray showed Light his FBI identification badge to prove he wasn't an accomplice. That was all Light needed, a name and a face. The bus hijacking ended when Osoreda saw Ryuk, panicked, fled the bus, and was hit by a car, exactly as Light had scripted using the Death Note. But Light didn't kill Ray Penber right away. He waited. And when the time came, he didn't just kill one FBI agent. He used Ray Penber to kill all 12 of them. Light approached Ray in a subway station and, through a carefully constructed scheme, forced Ray to write the names of all 11 other FBI agents in Japan on pages from the Death Note. Ray didn't know what he was writing on. He didn't know that the paper came from a supernatural notebook. He thought he was following instructions that would help the investigation. Instead, he was signing the death warrants of his entire team. All 12 FBI agents, including Ray himself, died of heart attacks, And before Ray collapsed on that subway platform, he turned around and saw Light standing there watching him die. In his final moments, Ray Penber realized that the quiet, polite college student he had been assigned to follow was the mass murderer the entire world was looking for. But by then, it was already over. What Light did to Ray Penber was horrifying enough. What he did to Ray's fiancée, Naomi Misora, was worse. Naomi was a former FBI agent herself, described as a first-rate investigator with remarkable abilities. After Ray's death, Naomi began conducting her own investigation. She was smart, dangerously smart. She had figured out things about Kira that even Elle hadn't pieced together yet. She knew that Kira could kill using methods other than hearted. She suspected that Kira had been on the same bus as Ray during the hijacking. She was getting close to the truth, and if she had managed to reach Elle with her findings, Light's entire operation could have been exposed. But before Naomi could contact the task force, she ran into Light Yagami. And this is where Light's manipulation reached a level that is almost hard to watch. Light introduced himself as the son of Soichiro Yagami, the chief of the National Police Agency. That much was true, and it immediately earned him a degree of trust. Naomi was cautious. She was smart enough to give Light a fake name, Shoko Maki, instead of her real one, but Light realized it was an alias when Ryuk, who was invisible to Naomi, laughed at the name she gave. So Light knew she was lying, and he knew he needed her real name to kill her. What followed was a masterclass in emotional manipulation. Light played the role of the concerned, helpful young man. He told Naomi that he was working with Elle on the investigation. He expressed sympathy for what had happened to Ray. He dangled the possibility that Naomi could join the task force and help catch the person who killed her fiancé. He slowly, carefully, patiently built her trust, layer by layer, until she believed that this young man was her best chance at getting justice for the man she loved. And then, when he needed her identification to officially bring her into the investigation, Naomi handed Light her driver's license. Her real name, Naomi Misora. Light had already written the details of her death in the notebook before she even finished handing it over. And then, once the death note took effect, once Naomi's eyes went blank and her mind was no longer her own, Light told her the truth. He told her that he was Kira. He even offered her his phone to call his father, knowing she couldn't do anything about it. She walked away, following the instructions Light had written, to commit suicide in a way that ensured her body would never be found. Light manipulated a grieving woman, exploited her love for her dead fiancé, used her intelligence against her, and then killed her while looking her in the eye. And he did it all with a calm expression on his face and a polite tone in his voice. He was 18 years old. But the manipulation didn't stop with strangers and enemies. Light turned the same cold, calculating approach on the people who were supposed to be closest to him. His own father, Soichiro Yagami, was one of his most useful tools. Soichiro was the chief of the National Police Agency and the head of the Kira task force. He was also a man who loved his son deeply and who could not bring himself to believe that Light could be Kira. Light used that love ruthlessly. He used his position as Soichiro's son to access information about the investigation. He knew which leads the police were following, what Elle was thinking, and how close they were getting to the truth. All because his father trusted him, and because Light was careful to maintain his image as the perfect, supportive son. Soichiro's trust in Light never wavered, even when the evidence pointed directly at his son. And Light counted on that. He knew that his father's love was a shield that would protect him from suspicion within the task force. Every time someone raised doubts about Light, Soichiro was there to defend him. And Light let him. He let his father put his career, his reputation, and eventually his life on the line to protect a son who was secretly the murderer Soichiro had dedicated his life to catching. Later in the series, when Soichiro made the Shinigami Eye deal to help the investigation against Mello and was fatally shot during a raid on the Mafia's hideout, Light was at his father's deathbed. And in those final moments, rather than grieving, rather than feeling the weight of watching his father die, Light spent his time trying to get his dying father to write down Mello's real name in the death note. He wanted Soichiro to use his last breaths as a weapon. When Soichiro died, Light's visible grief seemed to be less about losing his father and more about losing the chance to eliminate an enemy. Then there was Misa Amane. If what Light did to Naomi Misora was cruel, What he did to Misa over the course of the entire series was something closer to psychological destruction. Misa was a young model and actress who had become devoted to Kira after he killed the man who had murdered her parents. She obtained her own death note from a Shinigami named Rem and made the Shinigami Eye deal, giving her the ability to see anyone's name and lifespan just by looking at their face. The price was half of her remaining life. When she found Light and realized he was Kira, Misa fell completely in love with him. She told him she would do anything for him, anything at all. Light saw an opportunity and took it. He agreed to be Misa's boyfriend not because he felt anything for her, but because her Shinigami eyes made her useful. Sugumi Oba, the creator of Death Note, has stated that Light viewed Misa as a, quote, bad person who had killed non-criminals, and that he acted emotionally cold toward her and manipulated her. Light never loved Misa. He never even liked her, but he pretended to. He went on dates with her. He played the part of the attentive boyfriend. He said the things she needed to hear to keep her loyal. And in return, Misa gave him everything. She used her Shinigami eyes to identify targets for him. She served as the second Kira when he needed her to. She took the Shinigami eye deal not once but twice over the course of the series, halving her remaining lifespan each time, which meant that by the end, Misa had sacrificed 3/4 of the years she had left to live, all for a man who felt nothing for her. And when Misa stopped being useful, Light didn't even bother pretending anymore. Later in the series, he shifted his attention to Kiyomi Takada, a former girlfriend from college who had become a prominent television newscaster and an open supporter of Kira. Takada was more intelligent than Misa, more connected, and more useful to Light's plans at that stage. So he simply moved on, discarding Misa the way someone might discard a tool that had been used up. They were officially engaged at that point, and Light dropped her without a second thought because a better tool had come along. But perhaps the most impressive and disturbing manipulation Light ever pulled off involved someone who wasn't even human. Rem was a Shinigami, the death god who had given Misa her death note. Unlike Ryuk, who was indifferent to the affairs of humans and simply enjoyed watching, Rem genuinely cared about Misa. She had developed real protective feelings toward this girl, partly because another Shinigami named Jealous had sacrificed his own life to save Misa from being murdered by a stalker. Jealous had loved Misa from afar, and Rem had witnessed his death. She felt a responsibility to protect Misa in his absence. Light figured this out. He understood that Rem's love for Misa was a weakness he could exploit. Light constructed an elaborate plan in which Misa would resume killing criminals as Kira, which would draw L's suspicion back onto her. This would put Misa in danger of being caught and potentially executed. Light knew that Rem would not allow that to happen. He knew that Rem would do whatever it took to protect Misa, even if it meant sacrificing herself. And that's exactly what happened. Faced with the choice of watching Misa be captured by L or taking action, Rem wrote the real names of L and his assistant Watari into her death note, killing them both. But because Shinigami are not supposed to use the death note to extend human lives, killing to protect Misa meant that Rem herself would die. And she did. She crumbled to dust right there in the investigation headquarters. Light had manipulated a god of death into killing his greatest enemy and dying in the process. He eliminated L, removed Rem as a potential threat, and protected his cover, all with a single scheme. And when it was over, he stood in that room and smiled. That is who Light Yagami really was, beneath the perfect grades and the polite smile and the pressed uniform. He was someone who looked at every person, every relationship, every emotional connection in his life and asked a single question: how can this serve me? His father's love served as a shield. Misa's devotion served as a weapon. Naomi's grief served as an opening. Rei's duty served as a vulnerability. Rem's compassion served as a trigger. Even the task force members who worked alongside him every day, men like Matsuda, Aizawa, and Mogi, were nothing more than cover. They were props in the stage play Light was performing, a play in which he acted the role of the dedicated investigator while secretly being the killer they were all searching for. The scariest part isn't that Light manipulated these people. Plenty of fictional villains are manipulative. The scariest part is how good he was at it. Light never raised his voice. He never made threats. He never revealed his true feelings. He played the perfect son, the perfect boyfriend, the perfect colleague, the perfect student. And he did it so well that even the people who suspected him, Even L himself could never quite prove it. Light Yagami weaponized kindness. He weaponized trust. He took the most basic human needs, the need to be loved, the need to be helped, the need to believe that the people close to us are who they say they are, and he used those needs as entry points to destroy people from the inside out. And it worked. For years it worked. Light operated as Kira while standing in the middle of the very team trying to catch Kira, and nobody could touch him. He was untouchable not because he was powerful, but because he was willing to do something that most people are not willing to do. He was willing to treat every human being in his life, without exception, as a means to an end. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But there was one person who saw through the mask. One person who looked at Light Yagami's perfect surface and sensed the darkness underneath. One person who matched Light's intelligence, who challenged his plans, and who refused to stop hunting him no matter how dangerous it got. And the battle between these two minds would become one of the greatest psychological chess matches ever put on screen. Section 6. Light versus L, the psychological chess match. L. Lauliet was everything Light Yagami wasn't supposed to encounter. He was a ghost. A name without a face. A voice without a body. A mind that operated from the shadows and never stepped into the light. The world's greatest detective had solved cases that entire governments couldn't crack, and he had done it all while remaining completely anonymous. Nobody knew what L looked like. Nobody knew his real name. Nobody knew where he lived or how old he was. The only way to contact him was through his handler, a man named Watari. And even Watari's identity was a closely guarded secret. L was, in every way that mattered, the perfect opponent for someone who killed by writing names in a notebook. You can't kill what you can't name, and you can't name what you can't see. From the very beginning, L understood things about Kira that nobody else did. While the rest of the world was still trying to figure out whether the criminal deaths were connected, L had already concluded that they were the work of a single person. He deduced that Kira was in Japan based on the patterns of who was dying and when. He figured out that Kira needed a name and a face to kill, based on the Lynd L. Taylor broadcast. He noticed that the timing of the killings followed a pattern that suggested a student, because the deaths were concentrated outside of normal school hours, between 9 in the morning and 4 in the afternoon. And once the FBI agents were killed, and L examined which families they had been investigating, Light Yagami landed on his radar as a prime suspect. L didn't have proof. He didn't have evidence that would hold up in court, but he had something that was almost as dangerous to Light. He had instinct. And his instinct told him that the polite, brilliant, seemingly perfect son of the chief of police was hiding something monstrous. What made the dynamic between Light and L so compelling was that they were almost identical in some ways and completely opposite in others. Both were geniuses. Both had the kind of intelligence that set them apart from everyone around them. Both could think 10 steps ahead of a normal person and anticipate moves before they were made. Both were willing to take enormous risks to achieve their goals, and both were, in their own ways, deeply lonely people. Light was isolated by his sense of superiority, surrounded by people he considered beneath him. L was isolated by choice and necessity, living in hotel rooms and communicating through screens, unable to form normal human connections because of the nature of his work. But where Light saw the world as something to be controlled and reshaped according to his vision, L saw the world as a puzzle to be solved. Light believed he was justice. L believed in justice as a system, something bigger than any one person. Light killed people he judged to be evil. L caught people who broke the law and handed them over to the legal system. Light needed the world to recognize and worship him. L didn't care if anyone ever knew his name. In almost every way that counted, they were mirror images of each other. The same raw intelligence, pointed in completely opposite directions. Their first real interaction, beyond the Lynd L. Taylor broadcast, came when L enrolled at Toho University under the fake name Hideki Ryuga, the same name as a famous Japanese idol, specifically to get close to Light. Both Light and L had scored perfectly on the entrance exams, and they were asked to share the stage and read a speech at the freshman ceremony. Light noticed L staring at him during the exam and was immediately on guard. And then, during a conversation after the ceremony, L did something that nobody else in the series had the nerve to do. He told Light directly, to his face, that he was L. This was a calculated move. By revealing himself, L put Light in an impossible position. If Light was Kira, he couldn't kill L right away because doing so immediately after their meeting would make Light the obvious suspect. But now Light knew that the world's greatest detective was standing right in front of him, watching his every reaction, studying his body language, and waiting for him to slip. L had essentially handcuffed himself to his prime suspect, gambling that proximity would eventually force Kira into making a mistake. It was one of the boldest moves in the entire series, and it set the tone for everything that followed. From that point on, Light and L orbited each other like two planets caught in the same gravitational pull. L invited Light to join the Kira task force, partly because Light's intelligence was genuinely useful to the investigation, and partly because L wanted to keep his suspect close. Light accepted, partly because working alongside L gave him access to everything the investigation knew, and partly because he believed he could outsmart L from the inside. The result was a partnership built entirely on mutual suspicion. Two men who respected each other's intelligence, while each secretly working to destroy the other. L tested Light constantly. He presented Light with evidence and puzzles, watching to see if Light's reactions matched what an innocent person's reactions should be. One particularly clever moment came when L showed Light 3 photographs of messages that Kira had forced prisoners to write before they died. The messages, when arranged in a certain order, spelled out a partial sentence directed at L. Light recognized the correct order instantly because he was the one who had created the messages. But instead of pretending not to understand, Light's pride got the better of him, and he told L the correct arrangement. L then revealed a 4th photograph, a fake one that he had added himself. Someone who wasn't Kira would have naturally asked whether there were more photographs to complete the message, but Light hadn't asked, because he already knew there were only 3 real messages. L noted this. He didn't say anything out loud. But the camera lingered on his face, and you could see the gears turning. L also caught Light in a subtle verbal slip. During a conversation about the FBI agents who had been killed, L mentioned that investigators, including Ray Penber, had been sent to Japan. Light responded by saying that he was one of the people Ray had been investigating before Ray died. But L had never told Light which agent had been assigned to follow him. Light's knowledge of this detail was a red flag, and while L didn't call him out on it directly, it was clear that he filed it away. This was the nature of their entire relationship. Tiny moves, small tells, words chosen with surgical precision. Every conversation between Light and L was a battle happening on 2 levels. The surface level, where they discussed the case like colleagues, and the deeper level, where each one was probing the other for weaknesses. L once challenged Light to a tennis match, and Light considered throwing the game because L would know that Kira hated losing. But Light couldn't bring himself to lose on purpose, so he won. And L noted that. Even something as simple as a tennis game became a psychological battlefield. There was a strange intimacy to their relationship that the series never shied away from showing. During one stretch of the investigation, L literally handcuffed himself to Light, connecting them with a chain so that they were together 24 hours a day. L's reasoning was that he needed to observe Light constantly. But the result was something that looked almost like a forced friendship. They ate together, they worked together, they argued, they pushed each other, and in their quiet moments there were flashes of something that might have been genuine connection. 2 impossibly intelligent people who had finally found someone who could keep up with them. L himself acknowledged this in his own way. He told Light at one point that Light was his first friend. Whether L meant that sincerely or was using it as another tool to get Light to lower his guard is one of the great unanswered questions of the series. But the tragedy of it is that in another life, in a world where the Death Note never existed, these 2 could have been allies. Oba himself has said that without the Death Note, Light would have become one of the greatest police leaders in the world and would have worked alongside L to fight crime. Instead, they were locked in a battle where only one of them could survive. And L knew he was losing. That's the part that makes his story so heartbreaking. L was almost certain that Light was Kira. His instincts, his evidence, his observations, everything pointed to Light. But almost certain isn't proof. And the legal system that L believed in required proof. L couldn't arrest Light based on a feeling, no matter how strong that feeling was. He couldn't execute someone because of suspicious tennis matches and verbal slips, and Light knew that. Light knew that as long as he didn't make a definitive mistake, as long as there was always room for doubt, L could never touch him. The confinement arc put this tension on full display. L had both Light and Misa detained and monitored around the clock. But Light had anticipated this. Before being confined, he had set in motion an elaborate plan. He relinquished ownership of the Death Note, which caused him to lose all memories of ever being Kira. When Light woke up in his cell without those memories, he genuinely believed he was innocent. He argued for his release with real conviction, because he truly didn't remember being Kira. This was perhaps Light's most brilliant move, using the Death Note's own rules to create a version of himself that could pass any test, any interrogation, any observation, because that version of himself was, in that moment, actually innocent. L watched Light during confinement and saw the change. He saw that something was different, but he couldn't explain it, and when the killings resumed through a third Kira, Kyosuke Higuchi, the pressure to release Light became impossible to resist. L was forced to let him go, knowing in his gut that he was releasing the most dangerous person alive, but unable to prove it. The chess match ended the way chess matches between equals often end, not with a brilliant final move, but with one player being outmaneuvered through a sacrifice they didn't see coming. Light used Rem's love for Misa to force the Shinigami into killing L. It wasn't a fair victory. Light didn't outsmart L in a direct confrontation. He used a supernatural creature's emotions as a weapon, something L could never have predicted or defended against because L didn't even know such a thing was possible until it was too late. L died knowing that Light was Kira. He died knowing that he had been right all along. And he died knowing that being right wasn't enough. In the anime, L's final moments are quiet and devastating. He falls from his chair and Light catches him. They lock eyes. And in that brief moment, everything is laid bare. L sees the truth in Light's expression, the satisfaction, the triumph, the cold calculation. And Light looks down at the man who had pushed him harder than anyone ever had, the man who had been his only intellectual equal, and feels nothing but victory. L dies in Light's arms, and Light's face shifts from concern to a smile. The mask drops, just for a second, and the monster underneath is visible for anyone watching closely enough. L's death changed the series, but it also changed Light in ways that wouldn't become obvious until later. Because L wasn't just Light's enemy. L was the only person in the world who forced Light to be at his best. L was the competition that kept Light sharp, the challenge that kept his mind engaged, the one person whose existence demanded that Light think carefully about every single decision. And once that person was gone, once Light no longer had an equal standing across the board from him, something fundamental shifted inside him. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But the full weight of what L's absence did to Light's mind, and the slow unraveling that followed, wouldn't become clear until the mask Light wore every day started to crack in ways he couldn't control. Section 7. The Mask of Empathy. One of the most terrifying things about Light Yagami wasn't what he did. It was how normal he looked while doing it. Light led a double life for years, killing thousands of people while sitting at the dinner table with his family, attending classes at university, working alongside police investigators, and maintaining relationships that everyone around him believed were real. The world saw a handsome, polite, hardworking young man who cared about justice and loved his family. Behind that image was a mass murderer who felt nothing for the people he destroyed. And the gap between those two versions of Light, the one the world saw and the one that actually existed, is what made him one of the most dangerous characters in the history of fiction. Light's ability to perform emotions he didn't actually feel showed up almost immediately after he began using the Death Note. When L installed hidden cameras and wiretaps throughout the Yagami household to observe Light, most people in that situation would have panicked. They would have slipped up. They would have shown some sign of stress or fear that the cameras would pick up. But Light didn't panic. He figured out the cameras were there because of tiny details he had set up as traps. A door handle that was slightly out of position, and a piece of pencil lead placed on a hinge that had been broken. Once he knew he was being watched, he didn't try to remove the cameras. He didn't confront anyone about it. He simply became the most convincing, normal teenager in Japan. Light asked Ryuk to search the room and identify where all the cameras were placed. Then he adjusted his behavior perfectly. He studied on camera. He watched television on camera. He even planted scandalous magazines in his desk and made a show of hiding them, so that when L's team reviewed the footage, they would think that the reason Light was so secretive about his room was because he was embarrassed about his magazine collection, not because he was hiding a supernatural murder weapon. He continued to use the Death Note even with the cameras running, hiding a small portable television inside a bag of potato chips and writing names on a piece of the Death Note concealed within the bag. He would reach in, appear to be eating chips, and write names while watching criminal broadcasts on the tiny screen. All of this while knowing that L was watching his every move. The level of control required to pull that off, to act completely natural while committing murder on camera, is almost impossible to comprehend. But the cameras were just one example. Light's entire daily life was a performance. At home, he was the perfect son. He helped his sister Sayu with her homework. He sat at dinner with his family and made conversation. He showed appropriate interest in his father's work, asking the right questions at the right times. Questions that seemed like the curiosity of a supportive son, but were actually designed to extract information about the Kira investigation. His mother Sachiko never suspected a thing. Sayu never suspected a thing. They lived in the same house as a man who was responsible for more deaths than most wars produce, and they had no idea. Light made sure of that. Every interaction, every smile, every helping hand with math problems was calculated to maintain the image of the son they believed him to be. At school and later at university, Light was equally flawless. He maintained perfect grades while simultaneously running a global killing operation. He attended classes, studied for exams, scored #1 on nationwide tests, and earned admission to the prestigious To'o University, all while spending his private hours researching criminals and writing their names in the Death Note. His classmates saw a brilliant, well-adjusted student. His professor saw a model of academic excellence. Nobody saw anything wrong because there was nothing to see. Light had built a wall between his two lives so thick and so seamless that not a single crack showed on the surface. The task force was where Light's performance reached its most impressive and most disturbing level. After joining L's investigation team, Light spent every working day surrounded by men who were actively trying to catch Kira. He sat in their meetings, he reviewed their evidence, he contributed to their strategies, and he did all of it while being the very person they were hunting. The investigators, men like Matsuda, Aizawa, Mogi, and his own father Soichiro, worked alongside Light for years. They trusted him. They valued his input. Matsuda in particular seemed to genuinely like Light and look up to him, and Light used every ounce of that trust to stay one step ahead. When evidence pointed toward Light, he expressed the right amount of concern. When breakthroughs were made in the case, he showed the right amount of enthusiasm. When setbacks occurred, he displayed the right amount of frustration. Every emotional response was measured, controlled, and delivered with the precision of an actor who had rehearsed his lines 1,000 times. The real Light, the one who was silently monitoring every development and adjusting his plans accordingly, existed behind a wall that nobody in that room could see. After L's death, Light took over his identity and became the new L, leading the very investigation that was supposed to catch him. This was the ultimate expression of his. He was Kira, the mass murderer the world was either worshipping or trying to stop. He was also L, the world's greatest detective, supposedly leading the charge to bring Kira to justice. He held both roles simultaneously, using his position as L to control the flow of information, steer the investigation away from himself, and eliminate anyone who got too close. The task force trusted him completely. They had no reason not to. He had been vetted by the real L. He had been confined and monitored and released. He had proven his innocence through a process that they all witnessed. What they didn't know was that every step of that process had been scripted by Light himself, long before it happened. But the most painful examples of Light's emotional performance came in his personal relationships, in the moments where real human feelings were on the line, and Light responded with nothing but calculation. His relationship with Misa was one long exercise in pretending. Light went on dates with Misa. He kissed her. He told her what she needed to hear to stay loyal. He even agreed to become engaged to her later in the series. And none of it was real. Not a single moment of affection that Light showed Misa came from a genuine place. Oba has confirmed that Light viewed Misa as a bad person and manipulated her coldly. But Misa never knew that. Misa believed until the very end that Light loved her. She sacrificed years of her life, literally giving up portions of her remaining lifespan through the Shinigami ideals, for a man who was performing the role of boyfriend the same way he performed the role of innocent student, with perfect technique and zero feeling behind it. And then there was his father's death. This is the moment where Light's mask becomes genuinely horrifying. Soichiro Yagami, the man who had defended Light against every accusation, who had put his career and his freedom on the line to protect his son, who had loved Light unconditionally from the day he was born, lay dying in a hospital bed after being shot during the raid on Mello's hideout. Soichiro had made the Shinigami ideal, trading half his remaining lifespan for the ability to see people's real names, all to help the investigation. He had used that ability during the raid and had managed to learn Mello's real name before being fatally wounded. He was dying. His son was standing beside him. And what did Light do? He tried to get his father to write Mello's name in the death note. His father was taking his last breaths, and Light's primary concern was weaponizing those final moments. He wanted Soichiro to use the last of his strength to kill an enemy, not to comfort his father, not to tell him he loved him, not to hold his hand and let him go in peace. Light wanted one more use out of the man before he died. Soichiro didn't write the name. He died without killing Mello. And in the manga, the series notes something crucial. Because Light had given up ownership of the Death Note at that point in the timeline, his lifespan was visible above his head through the Shinigami eyes. Soichiro saw it. And because his son's lifespan was visible, Soichiro died believing that Light was not Kira, since Death Note owners don't have visible lifespans. It was the final mercy in Soichiro's life, dying with the belief that his son was innocent. And it was a mercy built entirely on a technicality that Light had engineered months earlier for completely different reasons. After Soichiro's death, Light's visible reaction appeared to be grief. He cried out. He showed anguish. But the series makes it clear that his distress had far more to do with the lost opportunity to kill Mello than with the loss of his father. The man who had raised him, who had shaped his sense of justice, who had given him every advantage in life, was gone. And Light processed that loss the same way he processed everything else, through the lens of how it affected his plans. This was the true horror of Light Yagami. Not the killing, not the Death Note, not the God complex. The true horror was that he could sit beside his dying father and think about strategy. He could hold a grieving woman's hand and calculate the best time to extract her real name. He could look L in the eye, catch him as he fell, and feel nothing but satisfaction. He could live inside a family that loved him, work alongside people who trusted him, and carry on a relationship with a woman who would die for him. And none of it penetrated the wall he had built around whatever was left of his real self. The question the series keeps circling back to is whether Light was always this way, or whether the Death Note made him this way. Was the ability to fake emotions something Light developed after the notebook, or was it something he had always possessed and simply never needed to use at this level before? The answer, based on everything the series shows us, is probably somewhere in between. Light was always good at reading people and presenting the right face for the right situation, but the Death Note took that skill and sharpened it into something lethal. It gave him a reason to use his talent for performance every single day, in every single interaction, with every single person he encountered. And the more he used it, the better he got. And the better he got, the further the real Light Yagami, the one who Oba said could understand the pain of others, retreated behind the mask, until it was no longer clear whether there was anyone left behind it at all. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But the series gives us one chance to answer that question, one window into who Light Yagami truly was underneath the mask. And it came during the strangest stretch of the entire story, a period when the Death Note was taken away, the memories were erased, and Light woke up in a prison cell genuinely believing he was innocent. What happened during those weeks reveals more about Light's true nature than anything else in the series, and it forces us to confront the most uncomfortable question Death Note ever asks. Section 8. The Memory Gambit. Who is Light without Kira? There is a stretch of Death Note that changes everything you think you know about Light Yagami. It lasts several weeks. It shows you a completely different person. And the cruelest part is that this different person was designed, engineered, and deployed by the monster who came before him. The version of Light Yagami who existed without his memories of the Death Note is the most tragic figure in the entire series. Because he was real, he was good, and he was built to be destroyed the moment he stopped being useful. To understand what happened, you have to understand the trap Light set for himself and everyone around him. By the time L had Misa Amane detained, and suspicion was closing in on Light from every direction, Light knew he couldn't just keep pretending to be innocent. L was too smart. The evidence was piling up. Sooner or later, Light was going to slip, and L was going to catch it. So Light designed a plan so ambitious and so layered that it's almost impossible to believe a teenager came up with it. He decided to stop being Kira entirely, not as an act, but for real. He would erase his own memories. The Death Note has a rule. When someone gives up ownership of a notebook, they lose all memories connected to it. Every conversation with their Shinigami, every name they wrote, every plan they made, all of it vanishes. But the memories don't just disappear and leave gaps. They get rewritten. The person's brain fills in the blanks with an alternate version of events that makes sense without the notebook. So Light wouldn't walk around confused and disoriented, wondering why he couldn't remember certain things. He would remember a completely different version of his own life, one where the Death Note never existed and he was never Kira. Before turning himself in, Light executed a series of moves that would make a chess grandmaster jealous. He swapped the ownership of the two Death Notes between the Shinigami, Ryuk, and Rem. He had Ryuk add 2 fake rules to the notebook that Rem carried, one stating that anyone who stopped writing names for 13 consecutive days would die, and another stating that destroying the notebook would kill everyone who had ever touched it. These fake rules would later protect Light from suspicion. He then instructed Rem to find a greedy, selfish person and give them the Death Note, with the condition that this person would continue killing criminals alongside their own targets. Rem chose Kyosuke Higuchi, a ruthless executive at the Yotsuba Corporation. Light also prepared something for his future self. Inside a watch that his father had given him when he started at Toho University, Light created a hidden compartment. By pulling the crown of the watch 4 times in quick succession, a small panel would slide open, revealing a tiny piece of Death Note paper and a pin. When the time came, his future self would use this to reclaim everything. Then Light buried the second Death Note in a forest and went to L. He told L that he believed he might unconsciously be Kira, that perhaps some part of his mind was committing murders without his awareness. He asked to be confined, monitored around the clock, until L was satisfied that Light was innocent. His father, Soichiro, was horrified at the idea of his son being imprisoned, but Light insisted. L agreed, though he suspected this was part of a larger strategy. Light was placed in a cell, his hands and feet bound, a camera watching his every movement. On the 7th day of his confinement, Light was talking to L through the monitor. He muttered something about needing to get rid of his useless pride. Those words, "get rid of it," were the signal he had arranged with Ryuk months earlier. The moment Ryuk heard them, no matter the context, he was to understand that Light was giving up ownership of the remaining Death Note. Ryuk walked out of the cell like a ghost passing through walls, and in that instant, everything changed. The series describes what happened next as a sudden, visible shift. L, Aizawa, and Matsuda were watching on the monitor, and they saw it. Something in Light's face changed. His expression, his posture, his entire energy became different. The confident, measured, calculating person who had calmly asked to be imprisoned was gone. In his place was a confused, frightened young man who genuinely did not understand why he was in a cell. Light began protesting. He told L that this was a mistake. He asked to be released. He insisted that he wasn't Kira and couldn't understand why L was still holding him. The task force members watching were stunned. This didn't make any sense. The person on the screen was not the same person who had walked into that cell 7 days ago. The illustrator, Takeshi Obata, was asked by his editors to make this change visible on the page. During the Yotsuba arc, Obata reverted Light's character design back to the way he looked in the very first chapter of the manga, with rounder, softer, more innocent eyes and features. It was the opposite of the sharp, intense, calculating face that Light had developed as Kira. Obata later said this was a tall order, because he had spent months perfecting how to draw Light as a villain, and now had to unlearn all of that in order to make the character look genuinely innocent again. And Light was genuinely innocent. That's the important part. This wasn't an act. This wasn't another layer of deception. Light Yagami, without his memories of the Death Note, was a fundamentally different person. He was still brilliant. He was still driven. He was still competitive and proud. But the coldness was gone. The calculation was gone. The willingness to use people as tools, to treat human lives as acceptable costs, to lie without hesitation or remorse, all of that had vanished along with the memories. During the weeks that followed, memoryless Light worked alongside L and the task force with genuine enthusiasm and real commitment. He didn't just go through the motions. He actively contributed to the investigation, using his intelligence to analyze patterns and develop leads. He was the one who figured out that the new Kira was connected to the Yotsuba Corporation by examining which companies were benefiting from the killings. He called Reiji Namikawa, one of the Yotsuba executives, and convinced him to delay the killings for a month and serve as a mole for the task force. These were real contributions from a person who genuinely wanted to catch Kira and prove his own innocence. L handcuffed himself to Light during this period, connecting them with a chain that kept them together around the clock. And during the time they spent chained together, something remarkable happened. Their relationship changed. The tension and suspicion that had defined every previous interaction between them softened into something that looked almost like real friendship. Light showed respect for L's abilities without the hidden resentment that Kira Light always carried. L, for his part, seemed to genuinely enjoy having an intellectual equal to work with, someone who could keep up with his thought process without any hidden agenda. They argued, they debated, they pushed each other, but it all felt authentic in a way that their earlier interactions never had. What the behind-the-scenes book, Death Note 13, How to Read, confirmed is that Yotsuba Arc Light was meant to show what his personality was like before the notebook corrupted him. This version of Light shared his father Soichiro's values almost exactly. He believed in playing fair. He refused to manipulate people or bend the law even when L suggested it as a practical method for getting things done. He had a strong moral code built on what his parents had taught him about right and wrong. He was essentially a younger version of Soichiro, idealistic and principled, and unwilling to compromise his ethics even when doing so would have been easier. But the series also didn't make memoryless Light into a perfect angel. He was still prideful. He still had a competitive streak that sometimes got the better of him. He punched L during one of their arguments after L told him that he looked like a mass murderer, despite calling Light his only friend moments earlier. He still believed, even without his Kira memories, that the original Kira's ideals were uncomfortably close to his own. He acknowledged that he found something appealing about the idea of removing criminals from the world. The seeds of what made him become Kira were still there, buried in his personality. They just didn't have the power or the permission to grow without the Death Note feeding them. And then it ended. The task force tracked down Higuchi as the Yotsuba Kira. They set a trap using Matsuda as bait on a live television broadcast, which forced Higuchi to reveal his methods. The police cornered Higuchi on a highway, arrested him, and found the Death Note in his car. Soichiro picked up the notebook first and screamed when he saw Rem, the Shinigami, standing next to the car. Mogi touched it and screamed too. L eventually held the notebook himself, and as his mind raced through the implications, connecting the notebook to everything he had learned about the second Kira and Misa's message about exchanging notebooks in Aoyama, Light took the Death Note. L's hands. The scream that Light let out when he touched the notebook is one of the most devastating moments in the series. Soichiro and Mogi had screamed because they saw a terrifying Shinigami for the first time. But Light's scream was different. It was the sound of every memory flooding back at once. The first kill, the hundreds of names, Ryuk, Rem, the plan, the God complex, the murders, the manipulations. Everything that memoryless Light had been blissfully free from came crashing back into his mind in a single overwhelming instant. Some fans and analysts believe that in that scream, you can hear the last gasp of the innocent Light Yagami, the real Light, experiencing a split second of horror at what he truly was before Kira swallowed him whole. And then, just like that, Kira was back. Light turned his back to L in the helicopter, and the look on his face shifted from shock to quiet triumph. He pulled the crown of his watch 4 times, opened the hidden compartment, pricked his finger with the pin, and used his own blood to write Kyosuke Higuchi's name on the tiny piece of Death Note paper. Moments later, on the ground below, Higuchi screamed and collapsed dead. Light had reclaimed ownership of the notebook, killed the man who could expose him, and positioned himself as the hero who had helped catch Kira. The fake 13-day rule in the notebook cleared both Light and Misa of any remaining suspicion. Even L, who still felt in his gut that something was wrong, couldn't argue against a rule that seemed to prove that anyone who stopped writing for 13 days would die, which meant Light and Misa couldn't be Kira since they had been confined for over 50 days without dying. Every single step had gone exactly as Light had planned it months ago. He had used his own innocence as a weapon. He had created a version of himself that could pass any test, survive any observation, and build trust with the very people hunting him. And then he had destroyed that version of himself the moment it stopped being useful. Memoryless Light was never a person to Kira. He was a tool, a temporary disguise, a puppet who didn't know he was a puppet. And that is what makes this arc so unbearable to think about. Because Memoryless Light was real. His concern for justice was real. His respect for L was real. His refusal to compromise his morals was real. For a brief window of time, the world got to see who Light Yagami could have been. The version of him that Oba said could have become one of the greatest police leaders in the world. The version that would have worked alongside L to fight crime, instead of becoming the greatest criminal L ever faced. That person existed. That person was alive and genuine and good. And Kira built him specifically to die. The cruelest thing about the memory gambit isn't what it did to Light, it's what it did to the people around him. Because during those weeks, the task force worked alongside a Light they could trust. L developed a genuine connection with someone who might have been his real friend. And Misa, who had also lost her memories and was freed from the blind devotion that the Death Note had amplified, existed in a state where she could have had a real life. All of that was temporary. All of that was designed to end the moment Light's fingers touched that notebook. Every real connection, every moment of genuine trust, every flash of authentic humanity was built on a foundation that Kira had rigged to self-destruct. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But of all the people who were used and discarded during the memory gambit, nobody suffered more than the person who had already given up everything for Light before the plan even started. Nobody was more thoroughly destroyed by Light's ability to weaponize love than the woman who had traded years of her own life for a man who viewed her as nothing more than a useful piece on his board. Section 9. Misa Amane, the psychology of Light's most tragic victim. Misa Amane was broken before Light Yagami ever found her. A year before the start of the series, Misa's parents were murdered during a robbery in their home. She was there. She saw it happen. The killer was arrested, but the trial dragged on, and public opinion began to shift in the murderer's favor, with some people suggesting he might have been falsely accused. Then, Kira killed him. In that single moment, the faceless mass murderer known as Kira became Misa's savior, the only force in the world that had given her justice when the legal system couldn't. From that point on, Misa's devotion to Kira wasn't just admiration, it was worship built on grief, on a desperate need to believe that someone powerful and righteous was watching over the world and punishing the people who deserved it. Then fate gave Misa her own death note, and everything got worse. A Shinigami named Jealous had been watching Misa from the Shinigami realm for a long time and had fallen in love with her. When a knife-wielding stalker attacked Misa one night, intending to kill her, Jealous wrote the stalker's name in his death note and saved her life. But Shinigami exists to take human life, not extend it. By saving Misa, Jealous broke the most fundamental rule of his kind, and he crumbled to dust, leaving behind nothing but his notebook. Another Shinigami, Rem, witnessed the whole thing and decided that Jealous would have wanted Misa to have his death note, so Rem brought it to her. From the moment Misa received that notebook, her only goal was to find Kira and thank him. She made the Shinigami Eye deal with Rem, trading half of her remaining lifespan for the ability to see any person's real name just by looking at their face. This was the first time Misa sacrificed years of her life, and she did it without hesitation, because finding Kira mattered more to her than how long she would live. She sent videotapes to the television station Sakura TV, announcing herself as a second Kira and declaring her support for Kira's mission. She moved to Tokyo specifically to track him down. And when she finally stood in front of Light Yagami, having used her Shinigami eyes to confirm his identity, she offered him everything. Her notebook, her eyes, her loyalty, her life. Light's response tells you everything you need to know about how this relationship would go. He didn't see a person standing in front of him. He saw a tool. Misa had the Shinigami eyes, which meant she could identify anyone's real name on sight, something Light desperately needed. She had her own death note, which gave him a second weapon, and she was so blindly devoted to him that she would do anything he asked without questioning it. Light agreed to be her boyfriend, but he told her up front that it would be an act. Misa heard those words and chose to believe she could change his mind. She never did. Oba, the creator of Death Note, confirmed that Light viewed Misa as a bad person and treated her coldly. Throughout the entire series, Light never showed Misa genuine affection. He went on dates with her when it served his plans. He held her hand when someone was watching. He kissed her when it kept her loyal. But every gesture was calculated. Every word was measured, and every moment of supposed tenderness was a performance designed to keep his most useful asset in place. Misa gave Light unconditional love. Light gave Misa a role in his strategy. The cruelest evidence of this came in the form of the Shinigami Eye deals. Misa made the trade twice. The first time, she gave up half her remaining lifespan to Rem in order to help Light. The second time, after the memory gambit had erased and then restored her memories, she made the same deal again, this time with Ryuk, because she had forgotten L's real name, and Light needed her to see it again. Each deal cut her remaining life in half. By the end of the second trade, Misa had sacrificed 3/4 of whatever natural lifespan she had left. She did this for a man who, according to his creator, felt nothing for her. And Misa knew, on some level, that Light didn't love her the way she loved him. There are moments in the series where her awareness of this surfaces, where the cheerful mask she wears cracks just enough to reveal the pain underneath. But she kept coming back. She kept sacrificing. She kept believing that if she just proved herself useful enough, devoted enough, willing to give up enough, Light would eventually see her as more than a piece on his board. He never did. Light eventually replaced Misa with Kiyomi Takada during the second half of the series. Takada was a former girlfriend from university who had become a prominent news anchor, and Light began using her as a public spokesperson for Kira, while also maintaining a personal relationship with her. He did this while still technically engaged to Misa. When Misa confronted Takada about their competing claims to Light, the scene was painful to watch, because Misa was fighting for the attention of a man who viewed both women as disposable tools. Neither of them meant anything to Light beyond what they could do for him. The only difference was that Takada was more useful to him at that moment than Misa was. But perhaps the most devastating part of Misa's story isn't what Light did to her directly. It's what he did through Rem. The Shinigami who had brought Misa the Death Note had grown to genuinely care about her, just as Jealous had before. Rem loved Misa in a way that was protective and selfless, the complete opposite of Light's cold manipulation, and Light saw that love and turned it into a weapon. He deliberately created a situation where Misa would be in danger of being caught and executed as the second Kyuda. He knew that Rem, faced with the choice of watching Misa die or intervening, would have no option but to act. And acting meant writing L's name in the Death Note, which would extend Misa's life and therefore kill Rem, because Shinigami who extend human lives are destroyed. Light engineered the death of a being who genuinely loved Misa in order to eliminate his greatest enemy. He used the one creature in the world that actually cared about Misa's well-being as a suicide weapon. And when Rem crumbled to dust after writing L and Watari's names, Light grabbed her notebook and pretended to be shocked. Misa lost the only protector who had ever loved her without conditions, and she didn't even know that Light was responsible. Two beings died for Misa Amane out of genuine love. Jealous died to save her from a stalker. Rem died to save her from L's investigation. Both sacrificed their existence because they cared about her survival more than their own. And the one person Misa chose to build her entire life around, the one person she gave everything to, saw her as nothing but a means to an end. The contrast between the love Misa received from the Shinigami and the emptiness she received from Light is one of the most heartbreaking dynamics in the entire series. After Light's death, the anime shows Misa standing alone on the ledge of a tall building, dressed in dark clothing, staring into the distance. The scene doesn't show what happens next, but the implication is impossible to. Oba speculated in Death Note 13, How to Read, that after someone, likely Matsuda, revealed that Light had died, Misa fell into despair and took her own life. The official guidebook lists her date of death as February 14th, Valentine's Day, a detail so symbolically cruel that it feels almost deliberate. The woman who sacrificed everything for love died on the day dedicated to celebrating it. Misa Amane is the clearest proof that Light Yagami's destruction wasn't limited to the criminals he wrote in his notebook. The people closest to him suffered in ways that were quieter, but no less devastating. He took a grieving young woman who had already lost her family, exploited her devotion, drained her of years of her life through the Shinigami ideals, weaponized the only being who truly loved her, and discarded her the moment she stopped being the most useful option. And through all of it, Misa kept loving him, kept sacrificing for him, kept believing that somewhere behind the mask, the real Light Yagami cared about her. She was wrong. But the fact that she never stopped believing it, even after everything he put her through, says something about the depth of damage that Light could inflict without ever writing a single name. Some of his worst crimes never involved the Death Note at all. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But Misa wasn't the only one who suffered after Light removed L from the board. With his greatest opponent gone and nobody left who could challenge him, Light entered a stretch of years where his power went unchecked, and his mind began to shift in ways that even Kira himself didn't fully recognize. Section 10. The Descent After L. The night L died, Light stood on the rooftop of the task force headquarters and looked out over the city, with Ryuk floating beside. Ryuk commented that with L gone, there wouldn't be anything interesting left to watch. Light told him he was wrong. He said the real work was just beginning. He was going to build his new world. And in that moment, standing above a city full of people who had no idea what had just happened, Light seemed more certain of himself than ever before. But what looked like a victory was actually the beginning of the end. Because L had been doing something for Light that Light never understood. L had been keeping him sharp. L had been keeping him careful. And without L, the discipline that had kept Light alive began to quietly fall apart. The first thing Light did after L's death was clean house. He killed every loose end he could find. The remaining 6 members of the Yotsuba group, the executives who had participated in the meetings where Higuchi used the Death Note to kill business rivals, all died of heart attacks. Iber, the con man who had worked for L during the Yotsuba investigation, was killed too. In the anime, Light gave him a heart attack in front of his own wife and son. Wedi, the professional thief who had helped L by planting surveillance equipment in the Yotsuba offices, died in a motorcycle accident that Light arranged through the Death Note. These were people who knew too much, people who had worked alongside L and might eventually connect the dots. Light erased them all without hesitation, without remorse, and without any of the careful planning that had defined his earlier kills. He simply wrote their names and moved on. Then Light took over L's identity. L had actually suggested before his death that if anything happened to him, Light should replace him. The task force agreed, and Light became the new L, the world's greatest detective, now hunting himself. He mused to himself about how easy it was to manipulate the remaining task force members into choosing him. He didn't even have to try hard. They trusted him. They liked him. And now they were working under the command of the very person they were supposed to be catching. For the next 5 years, Light operated in a state of near total control. He was simultaneously Kira, the god of the new world who killed criminals and shaped global behavior through fear, and L, the detective tasked with bringing Kira to justice. He controlled both sides of the board. There was nobody checking his moves, nobody questioning his decisions, nobody forcing him to think 3 steps ahead just to survive. He graduated from university, joined the national police like his father, and settled into a routine that should have been everything he ever wanted. But something changed during those 5 years. The series doesn't spend much time showing us what Light's daily life looked like during the time skip, but the evidence of the change is visible the moment the story resumes. The Light Yagami who emerges after the time skip is noticeably different from the one who killed L. He's more arrogant, he's less careful, he makes assumptions that the old Light never would have made, and most importantly, he treats the people around him with an even deeper level of contempt than before. During the years without opposition, Light had expanded Kira's influence dramatically. He used the internet to identify criminals whose names and faces were publicly available and killed them at an accelerating rate. By the time the story picks up again, Kira had become a global force. Some governments had begun accepting Kira's judgments in place of their own legal systems. The world was moving toward exactly the kind of order Light had always envisioned, a planet ruled by fear of divine punishment, with Light sitting invisibly at the center of it all. He requested through his L identity that all police and media stop making suspects' faces public, which forced the information onto the internet, where it was even easier for him to access. The system was feeding itself. But power without challenge does something to a person's mind. When Light was facing L every single day, he had to be perfect. Every word had to be calculated. Every reaction had to be measured. Every plan had to account for the possibility that the smartest person in the world was watching. That constant pressure, as exhausting as it must have been, forced Light to maintain a level of discipline that kept his worst impulses in check. Without L, those guardrails were gone. Light no longer had anyone to be afraid of, and fear had been the only thing keeping him from becoming completely reckless. The evidence of this showed up immediately when new threats appeared. When L died, his computer had automatically sent a message to an orphanage in England called Whammy's House, informing them of L's death. 2 young people at that orphanage, Near and Mello, had been raised as potential successors to L. Near was methodical, analytical, and cold in the way that L had been. Mello was impulsive, emotional, and willing to work outside the law, even partnering with the mafia to achieve his goals. Together, they represented a 2-pronged attack on Light from directions he hadn't anticipated. Near established the SPK, a task force of FBI and CIA agents, working under him to investigate Kira. He contacted the Japanese task force and immediately told them something that no one else had dared to say out loud. He told them he believed the real L was dead, and that the person calling himself L was a fake. Near suspected from very early on that Kira and the new L were the same person. This put Light on the defensive for the first time in years, and he didn't handle it well. Mello's approach was even more destabilizing. He kidnapped Light's sister Sayu and demanded the Death Note as ransom. This was a completely different kind of attack than anything L had ever tried. L had played chess. Mello played street warfare. He used violence, hostages, and the criminal underworld to put pressure on Light from angles that intelligence alone couldn't solve. The kidnapping of Sayu hit Light's family directly. And while Light arranged to get his sister back, the experience left Sayu traumatized. She became unresponsive and withdrawn, essentially broken by the ordeal. And Light's reaction to his sister's suffering was telling. He cared, but not enough to let it slow him down. Sayu was collateral damage in a war he intended to win. The old Light, the one who had gone toe-to-toe with L, would have approached Near and Mello with the same caution and precision he had used against the original L. But the new Light, the one who had spent 5 years as an unchallenged god, kept making choices that were driven by arrogance rather than strategy. He selected the television presenter, Demagawa, as Kira's public spokesperson, a loud and greedy man who attracted attention for all the wrong reasons, and eventually had to be killed by Mikami when he went out of control. He chose Teru Mikami, a prosecutor who worshipped Kira with fanatical devotion, to carry out killings on his behalf, trusting a person he had never met face-to-face with the most dangerous weapon in the world. And he renewed his relationship with Kiyomi Takada, using her as a communication channel to Mikami while pretending the meetings were part of the investigation. Each of these choices introduced a new variable that Light couldn't fully control. Demagawa was unpredictable. Mikami was zealous but rigid. Takada was intelligent but emotionally attached to Light in ways that complicated the operation. The old Light had kept his circle as small as possible. The new Light was building a network of followers, and every additional person in that network was a potential point of failure. L would have recognized this immediately. L would have seen that Light was overextending himself, relying on people whose loyalty was based on worship rather than understanding. But L was dead, and there was nobody left to force Light to see his own blind spots. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The cruelest irony of Light's post-L years is that the very thing he had fought so hard to achieve, the removal of his only real opponent, was the thing that guaranteed his eventual defeat. Without L pushing him, Light became sloppy. Without the fear of being caught, he became overconfident. Without an equal sitting across the board, he forgot what it felt like to be outplayed. And by the time Near and Mello began closing in on him from 2 different directions, The habits of 5 years of unchallenged power had already done their damage. Light didn't respect his new enemies the way he had respected El. He underestimated them. And that underestimation, born from years of believing himself untouchable, would lead to the single most devastating moment in the entire series. The day everything fell apart in a warehouse called the Yellow Box. Section 11. The Final Unraveling. Nier, Mello, and the Collapse of Control. Light Yagami's downfall didn't come from a single mistake. It came from a chain of events that started with 2 orphans in England and ended in an abandoned warehouse in Japan. Nier and Mello were never supposed to work together. They were rivals, raised at Whammy's house as potential successors to El, and they approached the Kira case from completely opposite directions. But it was the combination of their methods, one working inside the system and the other working outside it, that created the pressure Light couldn't survive. And the cruelest part is that Light had every advantage. He had the Death Note. He had El's identity. He had the task force under his command. He had years of experience outmaneuvering the smartest detective in the world, and he still lost. Because the 5 years he spent without a real opponent had rotted something essential inside his judgment. Nier operated like a colder, more detached version of El. He built the SPK, a task force of FBI and CIA agents, and methodically worked through the evidence. He told the Japanese task force early on that he believed the real El was dead, and that the current El was likely Kira himself. This was a bomb dropped into the middle of Light's operation, and it planted seeds of doubt among the task force members that Light couldn't fully uproot. Aizawa in particular began sharing information with Nier behind Light's back, which gave Nier a steady stream of intelligence from inside Light's own team. The wall of trust that Light had spent years building was cracking, and he didn't realize how badly until it was too late. Mello attacked from a completely different angle. He partnered with the Mafia, used violence and kidnapping as tools, and created chaos that Light's careful planning couldn't account for. When Mello kidnapped Sayu and demanded the Death Note as ransom, it forced Light into a reactive position for the first time since El's death. Light managed to get his sister back, but the notebook ended up in Mello's hands temporarily. The raid to recover it cost Soichiro his life, and Sayu was left traumatized and withdrawn. Mello's methods were messy and dangerous, but they were effective precisely because they were unpredictable. El had played chess. Mello flipped the board over and set it on fire. Light's response to these twin threats revealed how much he had changed since the days of outsmarting El. Instead of handling things himself with the precision that had defined his early years as Kira, he began delegating to people he couldn't fully control. He chose Teru Mikami, a prosecutor who worshipped Kira with almost religious devotion, to carry out killings on his behalf. Mikami was intelligent and disciplined, but he was also a fanatic. He saw the world in absolute terms, with people sorted into categories of good and evil, and he acted on his own judgment in ways that Light hadn't authorized. Light also used Kiyomi Takada as a communication channel to Mikami, adding yet another person to a chain that was growing longer and more fragile with every link. The plan Light designed for the final confrontation was, on paper, brilliant. He and Nier agreed to meet in person at the Yellow Box warehouse on January 28th. Light knew that Nier had been monitoring Mikami, and would eventually discover that Mikami was using a Death Note. Light anticipated that Nier would have one of his agents, Stephen Giovanni, swap Mikami's notebook with a fake. So Light had Mikami create his own fake notebook to use in public, while hiding the real one in a bank safety deposit box. Meanwhile, Takada would handle the actual killings, using pages torn from the real notebook. When the day of the meeting came, Nier would swap what he thought was the real notebook, but was actually Mikami's fake. Then Mikami would bring the real notebook from the bank and write the names of everyone in the warehouse except Light, killing Nier, the SBK, and the task force members in one stroke. It was a layered plan. It accounted for Nier's intelligence. It used misdirection within misdirection. And it would have worked if not for Mello. Days before the warehouse meeting, Mello kidnapped Takada. This was the event that broke the entire chain. Takada managed to kill Mello using a page of the Death Note she kept hidden on her person. But with Takada captured and potentially compromised, Mikami faced a crisis. The killings needed to continue, or Nier might suspect something was wrong. So Mikami, without consulting Light, and not knowing that Light had already killed Takada with his own hidden piece of the notebook, went to the bank and used the real death note to write Takada's name. This was the moment everything collapsed. Nier's agent, Giovanni, had been following Mikami. When Mikami broke his routine and visited the bank on a day he wasn't expected to, Giovanni investigated. He found the real death note, the one Light had been counting on remaining hidden and untouched until the warehouse meeting. Nier now had access to the actual notebook. He had Giovanni and his team work through the night to create an exact copy of the real notebook, page by page, and swap it with the original. So when the day of the meeting arrived, Mikami went to the bank and retrieved what he believed was the real death note. It was another fake. On January 28th, Light walked into the Yellow Box warehouse, confident that he was about to win. Nier was there with the SPK. The task force was there. Mikami arrived outside, peered through the door, used his Shinigami eyes to identify everyone's names and faces, and began writing in what he believed was the real notebook. Light counted the seconds. 40 seconds needed to pass for the death note to take effect. At 39 seconds, Light couldn't contain himself. He declared victory. He told Nier that he had lost. He announced with absolute certainty that everyone in that room except him would be dead in 1 second. Nobody died. The 40 seconds passed, and every person in that room was still standing. Nier calmly explained what had happened. He revealed that the notebook Mikami had used was a fake. He showed the names Mikami had written, which included every member of the SPK and the task force, but conspicuously left out one name: Light Yagami. The person Mikami had chosen not to kill was the person Kira would protect. It was undeniable proof. Light's reaction to being exposed is one of the most memorable sequences in the entire series. He denied everything at first. He claimed Nier had set him up, that the notebook was fabricated, that the evidence was planted. But Nier dismantled every argument with the same calm precision that L would have used. The task force members, the men who had worked alongside Light for years, stood in that warehouse and watched the mask finally come off. And when Light realized that words weren't going to save him, when he understood that every escape route had been sealed, he stopped pretending entirely. What came out of Light in those final minutes was something the task force had never seen. The polite, measured, composed young man they had known was gone. In his place was a screaming, desperate, ranting figure who openly declared himself the god of the new world. He justified every murder. He proclaimed that he was the only one who could save humanity. He called the people standing in front of him, the people who had trusted him and worked with him and believed in him, insignificant. The god complex that Light had kept hidden behind years of careful performance was finally on full display, and it was uglier than anyone in that room had imagined. Matsuda was the one who shot him. The young detective who had admired Light, who had believed in his innocence longer than almost anyone else, raised his gun and fired. He shot Light multiple times, screaming at him, the betrayal and fury pouring out of a man who had just learned that his hero was a monster. Light fell, wounded and bleeding, and in a final desperate move, tried to write Nier's name using the blood from his wounds and the piece of death note hidden in his watch. Matsuda nearly killed him right there, and would have if the other task force members hadn't held him back. In the anime, Light managed to escape the warehouse during a distraction caused by Mikami stabbing himself with his pen. Wounded and stumbling, Light fled through empty streets and collapsed in a stairwell. In the manga, he didn't make it out, but in both versions, the ending was the same. Ryuk, the Shinigami who had started everything by dropping a notebook into a schoolyard, took out his own death note and wrote Light Yagami's name. Light had always known this was possible. Ryuk had told him from the very beginning, on the day they first met, that when Light's time came, Ryuk would be the one to write his name. It was part of the deal. It was always going to end this way. Light begged. The person who had declared himself a god, who had killed thousands without hesitation, who had watched people die with a smile on his face, begged a Shinigami not to write his name. And Ryuk wrote it anyway. 40 seconds later, Light Yagami was dead. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But death is not the same as an ending, because the story of Light Yagami doesn't stop when his heart gives out. What he built, what he destroyed, what he proved about the nature of power and the fragility of the human mind, Those things outlast the person who set them in motion. And understanding what Light's story truly means requires stepping back from the details and looking at the full picture of what Death Note was really trying to say. Section 12. The Death of a God. What Light Yagami teaches us about power. Light Yagami died on the floor with his arms stretched out and his eyes wide open, staring at nothing. The god of the new world, the person who had held the power of life and death over the entire planet, spent his final seconds the same way every other human being does. Afraid, alone, and completely powerless to stop what was coming. Ryuk had told him this would happen. On the very first day they met, when Light was still a 17-year-old sitting in his bedroom and trying to make sense of the impossible thing that had fallen into his life, Ryuk made it clear. He said that when Light eventually died, Ryuk would be the one to write his name. There was no heaven waiting for Death Note users. There was no hell. There was nothing. And Light, who had spent 6 years building himself into a god, ended up exactly where the Shinigami said he would. Nowhere. But Light's death doesn't close the book on what his story means. If anything, it opens it. Because Death Note was never really a story about a magic notebook, or a Shinigami, or a detective in a hotel room eating cake. It was a story about what happens when a person who already believes they are better than everyone else is given the power to act on that belief without consequences. And the answer, as the series shows over the course of 108 manga chapters and 37 anime episodes, is that it destroys them. Not quickly, not dramatically, but slowly, from the inside out, until there is nothing left of the person they used to be. Light Yagami before the Death Note was not a bad person. The series goes out of its way to establish this. He was brilliant, kind to his family, helpful to his father's work, admired by his classmates, and genuinely bothered by the injustice he saw in the world. Oba himself said that without the notebook, Light would have become one of the greatest police leaders the world had ever seen. He had the intelligence, the work ethic, the moral framework, and the drive to make a real difference through legitimate means. The Yotsuba arc proved this. When the Death Note was taken away and the memories were erased, the person underneath was someone worth admiring, someone worth rooting for, someone who could have been a hero in a different story. But that is exactly what makes Light's fall so devastating. He wasn't a monster who was given power. He was a good person who was given power and became a monster. The Death Note didn't rewrite his brain. It didn't possess him. It didn't force him to do anything. Every single choice Light made after picking up that notebook was his own. He chose to test it. He chose to keep using it after the first kill. He chose to rationalize. He chose to escalate. He chose to build the identity of Kira. He chose to declare himself a god. And at every step along the way, there was a moment where he could have stopped. He could have burned the notebook. He could have handed it to the police. He could have walked away. He never did. The genius of Death Note is that it makes you understand why he didn't. The series doesn't present Light's transformation as something alien or incomprehensible. It presents it as something terrifyingly logical. If you genuinely believed you were smarter than everyone around you, and you were given a tool that could reshape the world according to your vision, and nobody could stop you from using it, how long would it take before you started believing you had the right to use it? How many justified kills before the unjustified ones start feeling justified too? How many rationalizations before the rationalizations stop being necessary? Because you've convinced yourself so completely that questioning your own actions feels like a waste of time. Light didn't wake up one morning and decide to become evil. He took one small step after another, each one feeling reasonable at the time, until he looked up and realized he was standing in a place where killing his own father's colleagues felt like a strategic necessity rather than an act of horror. This is the pattern that Death Note keeps returning to across every relationship Light had. His father loved him unconditionally and defended him against every accusation, and Light tried to use his father's dying moments to kill an enemy. Misa sacrificed 3/4 of her lifespan for him, and Light viewed her as a tool to be discarded when a better option appeared. El was the closest thing Light ever had to an intellectual equal, and Light engineered his death without a second thought. Rem loved Misa enough to die for her, and Light weaponized that love to eliminate his greatest threat. Every person who got close to Light Yagami was eventually consumed by his mission, treated as a resource to be spent rather than a human being to be valued. And the people who worshipped him didn't fare much better. Mikami devoted his entire life to Kira's vision of justice and ended up dead in a prison cell, broken and abandoned by the god he believed in. Takada believed she was Light's chosen partner in the New World and was killed by the very person she trusted the most. The millions of people around the world who supported Kira, who prayed to him, who genuinely believed he was making the world safer, were following a college student who saw them as nothing more than numbers in his strategy. Light didn't love his followers. He didn't even think about them as people. They were a resource, a source of validation, a tool for applying pressure on governments and institutions. The moment they stopped being useful, they became irrelevant. What makes this even more disturbing is that Light's new world was actually, by some measures, working. Crime rates dropped, wars decreased. People were afraid to break the law because they believed a supernatural force would punish them. On a purely statistical level, Kira's system was producing results, and the series forces the audience to sit with that discomfort, to acknowledge that a world ruled by fear can be a safer world in certain measurable ways, while also understanding the cost of that safety. Because what Light built wasn't justice, it was obedience. People didn't stop committing crimes because they understood right from wrong. They stopped because they were terrified of dying. And the difference between a just society and a fearful one is the difference between a world worth living in and a prison that just happens to have nice scenery. Nier understood this. That's why he fought Light so hard, despite being younger and less experienced. L understood it too, which is why he refused to give up even when the evidence kept slipping through his fingers. And Soichiro Yagami understood it better than anyone, which is why he could never bring himself to write Mello's name in the Death Note, even when he was dying. Soichiro, the man whose values Light once shared, the man who represented everything Light could have been, died holding the line between justice and murder. He had the power to kill, and he chose not to use it. That choice, that refusal, is the moral center of the entire series. Power means nothing if you don't know when not to use it. The final image of Light Yagami in the anime is a body lying on a metal staircase, eyes open, blood pooling beneath him, while somewhere nearby his sister sits in a hospital, unable to respond to the world. His mother carries on without knowing what her son truly was. And Misa stands on the edge of a building, choosing between a life without light and no life at all. That's the real cost of the new world. Not the criminals who died, not the FBI agents or the police officers or the Yotsuba executives. The real cost was borne by the people who loved Light Yagami, who believed in him, who trusted him, and who were destroyed not by the Death Note itself, but by the person holding it. 1 year after Light's death, the world returned to the way it was before Kira. Crime rates went back up, the fear faded. Governments resumed their normal operations. Everything Light had built, every death he had caused, every relationship he had destroyed, every year Misa had sacrificed, every person Rem and Jealous had died to protect, all of it amounted to nothing. The new world Light promised was never real. It was a castle built on fear. And the moment the source of that fear was gone, the castle collapsed. 6 years of murder, manipulation, and suffering, and the world simply moved on as if none of it had ever happened. That is the final lesson of Death Note. Not that power corrupts, although it does. Not that absolute power corrupts absolutely, although it does that too. The final lesson is simpler and sadder than any of those. It's that a brilliant young man, with every advantage in the world, who could have used his gifts to help people in ways that actually lasted, chose instead to play God. And playing God cost him everything. His family, his friendships, his humanity, and eventually his life. And when it was all over, when the notebook was closed and the Shinigami went home, the world didn't even notice he was gone. Light Yagami is one of the greatest characters ever written. Not because he was a hero, not because he was a villain, but because he was both, at different times, and the line between those two things was so thin that even the people closest to him couldn't always tell which one they were looking at. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.